Welcome to Truly Scary Ouija Stories. Smash like and subscribe to tread the thin line between reality and the surreal. Let's begin our eerie expedition.
Number Part 1. Echoes of the Forgotten Pact. Every night, the same nightmare, a cold, dark room, the faint glow of the Ouija board, and whispered words of a pact we were too naive to comprehend. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the echo of laughter and screams still ringing in my ears, knowing deep down that the spirit was never truly gone. The autumn air hung heavy in my bedroom, wrapping me in a chilling embrace. I sat upright, heart pounding, breath that came in short, sharp bursts. The nightmare had returned, more vivid than ever. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision as if mocking me with their presence, teasing the edge of my sanity. It had been years since that playful college night with the Ouija board, a night that now seemed cloaked in a dark haze. Back then, I was a different person, skeptical, carefree, and dismissive of anything otherworldly. But time had a way of reshaping beliefs, especially when night after night, an unseen force whispered hauntingly personal messages into your ear. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. The room felt foreign, as though an unseen presence had shifted everything slightly out of place while I slept. I glanced at the clock. 2:22 a.m. Typical. I pushed back the covers and moved toward the kitchen, seeking the solace of a lukewarm glass of water. The wooden floors creaked beneath my footsteps, a rhythmic accompaniment to my racing thoughts. The kitchen seemed normal at first glance, the soft hum of the refrigerator a comforting constant. But then I noticed the knife. It lay on the counter, gleaming under the dim kitchen light, distinctly out of place. My pulse quickened. I was certain I had left it in the drawer. As I reached out to put the knife away, the lights flickered. A rush of cold air prickled my skin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Suddenly, the knife slid an inch towards me. I jerked my hand back, heart thumping painfully in my chest. Eyes wide, I scanned the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Calm down, Sarah," I whispered to myself, trying to regain some semblance of control. But a part of me, the part molded by countless nights of terror, knew that calm was a luxury I could no longer afford. That was when my phone buzzed. I jumped, my nerves already taut as a bowstring. Hesitantly, I approached the counter and picked it up, my hands shaking. The screen showed a message from Mark, a name I hadn't seen in years. "Sarah, we need to talk. It's important. About the board. Call me." A familiar dread washed over me, so I wasn't the only one being haunted by the past. My mind raced as I dialed his number, the ringing almost deafening in the silent kitchen. He picked up on the second ring. "Sarah," his voice crackled through the speaker, weighted with urgency. "Are you okay?" "Mark, what the hell is going on?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You're not going to believe me," he said, "but it's starting again. I think it never stopped." My blood ran cold. The shadows in my room had returned to my life, and they were spreading like an insidious plague. Before I could respond, the sound of shuffling feet caught my ear. Startled, I glanced at the doorway, but saw nothing. My hand tightened around the phone. Mark's voice continued, drawing me back. "We need to find Emily. Meet me at the old cafe tomorrow. We need to figure this out." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Okay, I'll be there." Hanging up, I stared at the phone, trying to digest the flood of emotions and the looming sense of dread. I grabbed the knife and shoved it back into the drawer, resolving to push away the gnawing fear that had taken root in my chest. My unease clung to me as I ascended the stairs while making my way back to my bedroom. The list of the mundane tasks ahead couldn't mask it, the creeping coldness, the eerie familiarity of this dread. I crawled into bed, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily, if at all. Mark's voice echoed in my mind, along with the sinister whispers that seemed to permeate the very air of my existence. Morning came with a reluctant sense of normalcy. Routine was my sanctuary. Yet, as I dressed and braced myself for the day ahead, the unsettling events of the previous night lingered, a dark cloud over my thoughts. As I sipped my coffee, an insistent knock at the door shattered my tenuous calm. I nearly jumped out of my skin, the remnants of adrenaline flaring up once more. I approached cautiously and peered through the peephole. It was Mark, looking disheveled and agitated. With a deep breath, I opened the door. "Hey," he said, his voice heavy with unspoken fears. "Come in," I replied, stepping aside to let him enter. We settled in the living room, and I noticed the dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "What's happening, Mark? What's going on?" I asked, unable to hide the quiver in my voice. He leaned forward, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. It's back, Sarah. The spirit. It's been haunting all of us. This can't be a coincidence. Terry's dead. Hung himself 6 days ago." His voice broke, and his eyes glistened with tears he fought to hold back. My heart sank. "Terry? Gone?" "I thought I was losing my mind," I said quietly. "But these things, they're real then?" I could barely bring myself to meet his gaze. Mark nodded. "We have to find Emily. She's been having terrifying visions, nightmares that are more like memories, that might be the key to understanding it all." "Do you think she'll be willing to help?" I asked, remembering Emily's fragile nature, her constant battle with anxiety. "We have to try," he insisted. "We can't face this alone." As we prepared to leave and find Emily, a shadow flickered just outside the window, disappearing the moment we turned to look. I shivered, my mind teetering on the edge of panic and resolve. Whatever this was, it was coming for us, and hiding from it was no longer an option. On part 2, Echoes of the Forgotten Pact. Mark and I didn't waste any time. We drove to the local cafe we used to frequent during our college days. The place was nestled on a quiet street, its warm lights and familiar decor once serving as a sanctuary from the world outside. Today, it felt like a thin veil against the looming darkness. We found Emily sitting in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. Her hair was longer now, cascading down her shoulders in dark waves. She glanced up, her eyes widening with a mix of relief and terror as she saw us approach. "Emily, it's good to see you," I said, sliding into the booth opposite her. She gave a weak smile. "You too, Sarah. Mark." Mark sat down next to me, his presence a reassuring strength. "Em, we're all in this together. We're here to figure it out." Her eyes welled with tears as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been so scared. It's like the spirit's with me all the time. The dreams, the paintings. I don't know what to do." "Show us," Mark urged gently. Emily hesitated, but then pulled a sketchbook from her bag. She flipped open the pages, revealing disturbing images of shadowy figures, twisted faces, and the Ouija board. Each drawing seemed to pulse with a haunting energy, as if the spirit had guided her hand. "It's been guiding you," I murmured, unable to tear my eyes away from the illustrations. Emily nodded. "I think it's trying to tell us something, but I don't understand what." "Do you have anything that might shed light on the spirit's history?" Mark asked, leaning in closer. She hesitated before she pulled out an old letter, its paper worn and yellowed with age. "I found this among my grandmother's belongings. It mentions a pact, something our ancestors were involved in. It's in another language, though." Mark and I exchanged glances. This letter could be the key, but we needed someone who could decode it. We decided to visit Mark's apartment, where he had accumulated a collection of research materials over the past few weeks, books, letters, and articles that might help us. As we gathered our things, an unsettling feeling settled over me, a sensation of being watched. The cafe's warm ambience suddenly felt cold and foreboding. I glanced around but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. We left the cafe together, Mark leading the way with determined strides. Emily clutched her sketchbook to her chest as if it were a protective talisman. My thoughts were a maelstrom of fear and urgent questions. What had we unleashed? And more importantly, how could we stop it? Arriving at Mark's apartment, we were greeted by the sight of cluttered surfaces covered in documents and books. It was clear he had been obsessively trying to piece together the puzzle. His living space turned into a chaotic library of horror research. "Make yourselves comfortable," Mark said, gesturing at the couch. Emily and I sat down, while Mark rummaged through a pile of papers. He emerged with a triumphant look, holding a book that appeared to be a translation guide. "I found this guide that might help us translate Emily's letter," he explained, flipping through the pages. The minutes ticked by as we pored over the letter, cross-referencing the old language with the translation guide. Gradually, a chilling narrative unfolded, the story of a vengeful spirit bound by a pact made generations ago. It spoke of betrayal and sacrifice, echoing the themes that had haunted our dreams and visions. "We're dealing with something ancient and vengeful," Mark said gravely. Suddenly, Emily gasped, clutching her head. Her eyes widened in terror, and she started to shake. "It's here! It's here!" Before we could react, the temperature in the room plummeted, our breaths visible in the sudden chill. A shadowy figure materialized in the corner of the room, its form twisting and contorting as if struggling to maintain a shape in the earthly realm. The lights flickered, and a low, guttural growl emanated from the figure. Emily screamed, her voice raw and filled with fear. Mark and I sprang into action, trying to pull her away from the malevolent presence, but it felt as if an invisible force was holding her in place. "Emily, get out of there!" I yelled, my own voice shaking with terror. With a surge of adrenaline, Mark lunged forward, breaking the invisible grip and pulling Emily away from the entity. The spirit snarled, its cry piercing the air and causing the lights to burst, plunging us into darkness. We stumbled out of the apartment, our breaths ragged with fear and exertion. Once outside, we didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the streetlights. Emily was trembling, her voice barely a whisper. "It's getting stronger." I held her close, fearing for all our lives. Whatever this spirit was, it was more powerful than we had ever imagined, and it wasn't going to let us go easily. Part 3. Echoes of the Forgotten Pact. In the hours that followed, a plan formed out of sheer desperation. We needed answers, and the only place left to search was the house of the friend who had initiated the Ouija session, Robert. It was his family history that was tied to the spirit, and his betrayal had led us here. It was time to confront him and find the final pieces of the puzzle. We drove through the night, the silence between us heavy and laden with fear. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Emily sat in the back, her eyes wide and haunted, clutching her sketchbook as a lifeline. We pulled up to Robert's ancestral home, a grand but forlorn mansion that seemed to breathe its own history of secrets and lies. Robert met us at the door, his face gaunt and eyes hollow as if the weight of his guilt had drained the life out of him. Without a word, he led us inside. The house exuded a chilling aura, and the air felt thick with a menacing presence. We gathered in the living room, the flicker of candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. Robert's voice was trembling as he began to speak. "When I suggested the Ouija board that night, I didn't realize what I was fully doing. I thought it was just a game, a way to share my family's dark history. I didn't know it would lead to this." "The spirit," Emily whispered. "Tell us about it." Robert swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting the spirit to manifest at any moment. "The spirit was bound to my family generations ago through a blood pact. It demands a life for life to break free, but when I tried to pass the curse onto someone else, I failed to control it. It needs more than just a sacrifice. It needs our suffering." Mark's eyes flashed with anger. "You knew about this all along and you still went through with it? Terry is dead because of you." Robert paled and trembled. "I was desperate. I thought I could trick it. But now it's too powerful." The tension in the room was palpable, and the shadows seemed to close in, suffocating us. Suddenly, the room grew icy cold, and a series of loud bangs jolted us. The spirit's presence was unmistakable, an ominous force filling the room. The candles flickered violently, and one by one they were snuffed out by an unseen hand. In the darkness, a deep, resonating voice echoed through the room, chilling us to the bone. The pact must be fulfilled, suffering must be endured. The spirit materialized, a swirling mass of dark energy with eyes glowing like embers. It loomed over us, emanating hatred and malice. Emily screamed, and I could feel the terror threatening to overwhelm me. But in that moment of sheer panic, I realized something. Our fear was its power. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice steady despite the quaking of my body. "We made a mistake, but we won't be your pawns anymore." The spirit's bleak eyes fixed on me, and it surged forward. Mark stepped protectively in front of Emily, and Robert fell to his knees, sobbing. Desperation clawed at my mind. There had to be another way to end this. The spirit laughed, a bone-chilling sound. "You cannot escape." Without warning, Robert leapt to his feet, his face twisted in anguish. "No, if it's suffering you want, take me." He grabbed a nearby ceremonial dagger. Rob, no, Mark shouted, trying to intervene, but it was too late. With a swift motion, Robert slashed the dagger across his arm, drawing deep crimson lines. Blood pooled on the floor, and the spirit seemed to feed off his agony, its form growing more solid. Please, end this, Robert begged, his voice broken. The spirit paused, considering. One life is not enough. The pact is not complete. Desperation turned to hopelessness. The spirit's power was beyond our control, and Robert's sacrifice only fueled its hunger. It demanded more, a lifetime of suffering and fear for each of us. The realization struck me like a blow. We were its prisoners. The spirit began to dissipate, but its echoing voice lingered. I will be with you always until the pact is fulfilled. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of our doomed fate pressing on us. Robert collapsed, his life draining away, leaving behind a haunting reminder of what we had unleashed. As we carried Robert's body to a somber resting place, the full weight of our situation settled over us. The spirit would never fully release us. It thrived on our fear and pain, bound by the ancient curse that ran deeper than we had ever understood. We left the house, each step heavy with the dread of our eternal torment. Mark, Emily, and I made a silent pact of our own, to keep fighting, to seek any way we could to break the cycle, but always knowing the shadow of the spirit loomed just beyond reach. As we drove away, the sun rose, casting a hollow light on the haunted landscape. I glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing not just our reflection, but the lingering presence of the malevolent force that would follow us for the rest of our days.
I thought it was just a game. The night we placed our fingers on that Ouija board, I never imagined it would open a gate to something so vile, so hungry to break through into our world. The wind howled outside Sarah's old Victorian house, its creaks and groans almost a third participant in our ghost stories. The dim light from candles scattered around the room flickered against the walls, casting eerie shadows that danced ominously on the aged wallpaper. We huddled around the coffee table, its mahogany surface nearly as ancient as the house itself. The centerpiece was the battered Ouija board Sarah found in her grandmother's attic, its letters barely visible, the once glossy planchette now a dull relic of the past. Sarah's eyes sparkled with excitement, a stark contrast to Jason's furrowed brow and my own skeptical curiosity. She placed the board in the middle of the table with an almost reverent care, as if she believed its power. "Come on, Ethan, don't be such a spoilsport," she teased, her voice a mix of mischief and encouragement. I shrugged, trying to mask my growing unease. All right, but if anything weird happens, I'm blaming you." Jason chuckled nervously. "Yeah, Sarah, this was your idea after all." We placed our fingers on the planchette. It was ice cold against my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. Sarah began the ritual, her voice a soft murmur barely audible over the wind. "Spirits of the past, we seek your presence. We wish to communicate. Give us a sign." For a long moment, nothing happened. The candle flames flickered in the draft, but the air felt thicker, as if holding its breath. Just as I was about to make a joke, the planchette moved. It was subtle at first, barely a twitch, but it quickly gained momentum. Elias. The name sent a chill down my spine. No one spoke. I glanced at Sarah. Her hands trembled slightly, her face pale. Jason's eyes were wide, disbelief etched across his features. "Is this some kind of trick?" I asked, but my voice lacked conviction. Deep down, I knew none of us were capable of moving the planchette like that. Sarah shook her head slowly. "No, I don't think so." We asked more questions, but the answers only grew more cryptic and disturbing. Elias seemed to know things about us, secrets from our past, fears we never voiced. The air grew colder, and shadows seemed to move just beyond the edge of the candlelight. "Let's stop," Jason said, his voice shaky. "This isn't funny anymore." Sarah hesitated, her fingers still on the planchette. I could see the conflict in her eyes, a mixture of curiosity and dread. "Maybe we unlocked something. We can't just—" Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the hallway, cutting her off mid-sentence. We all froze, silence gripping us in a chokehold. The thud came again, closer this time, as if something heavy was being dragged. Jason was the first to break the silence. "We should check that out, make sure it's not, an intruder." We agreed, if only to break the oppressive atmosphere. We stood, the floorboards creaking under our weight, and edged cautiously toward the hallway. Every step felt like walking through molasses. The air grew heavier, the shadows darker. The sound led us to the staircase leading to the attic. Sarah hesitated, looking back at me and Jason. It came from up there. Jason swallowed hard, his face a mask of reluctant bravery. All right, let's get this over with. The wooden steps groaned as we ascended, each creak a testament to the house's age. The flickering light from a single hanging bulb barely penetrated the darkness, casting an uneven glow that made the shadows seem alive. When we reached the attic door, it stood ajar, the edges darkened as if touched by soot. With a quiet nod, Sarah pushed it open, revealing the room beyond. Dust hung in the air, caught in the beam of our flashlight. Old furniture, covered in white sheets, loomed like forgotten specters, their shapes distorted and menacing. There, in the middle of the room, an old trunk stood open, its contents strewn about haphazardly. Papers, photographs, and trinkets from a bygone era lay scattered across the floor. At the edge of the chaos, an open diary caught my eye, the name Elias prominently scrawled across the yellowed pages. Sarah picked it up, her hands trembling. "This must be my grandmother's," she whispered, flipping through the worn pages. Before we could make sense of it, the attic door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. We spun around, hearts racing, but saw nothing. A cold breeze brushed against our necks, carrying the faint, hollow whisper of a word we couldn't quite catch. Elias. We were no longer just playing a game. The darkness we had invited was real, and it had intentions of its own. Sarah's fingers traced the name in the diary, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. This must be the spirit we contacted. But why is he here now? Jason stepped closer, glancing over her shoulder at the faded handwriting. Maybe it's some kind of warning or a record of what happened before. I felt a growing sense of dread as Sarah continued reading aloud. The entries recounted how her grandmother and her friends had once summoned Elias during a seance, only to realize too late the malevolent nature of the spirit. They had made a blood pact to seal him away, a pact that seemed fragile and disturbingly easier to break. "We need to leave," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We should get out of this house right now." Sarah clutched the diary to her chest as if it were a lifeline. "No, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Maybe there's a way to stop it." A low creak echoed through the attic, and we all spun around. For a split second, I could swear I saw a shadowy figure at the door, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness. The temperature dropped, and the whispering returned, growing louder and more insistent. "Elias! Elias!" Jason grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the stairs. "Ethan's right. We can't stay here." But Sarah was rooted to the spot, her eyes glazed over as she stared into the shadows. "Elias, what do you want?" she called out, her voice shaky but steadied by an intense need to know. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "Release." Without waiting for further clarification, we hustled Sarah out of the attic and down the stairs, but the house seemed determined to fight back. Wood splintered, lights flickered, and the walls groaned under an unseen pressure. It felt as though the very structure of the house was shifting, turning against us. Back in the living room, Sarah fell to her knees, clutching her head as if trying to block out a persistent noise. "He's in my head," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He won't stop talking." "We need to destroy the board," I said, looking at Jason for support. "We have to find a way to sever the connection." Jason nodded, his face pale but resolute. "But how? If burning it doesn't work, we might just make things worse." Sarah suddenly grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "In the diary, there's a ritual. We need to perform it. It's the only way to seal him back." We scrambled to find the entry she spoke of. The ritual was intricate, involving the symbols on the board and a few personal items tied to those who had originally summoned Elias. "Blood of the Pact Makers," Sarah read aloud. "We need something that belonged to my grandmother and her friends." I racked my brain, realizing the difficulty of the task. We knew almost nothing about the original group, except for a few photographs. A sudden idea struck me. "Sarah, does your grandmother have a keepsake box or something? Old letters, maybe?" "Yes," she said, her voice filled with a desperate hope, "in her bedroom." We moved quickly, the house seeming to resist our every step. When we reached the bedroom, the atmosphere was stifling. An old cedar box sat on the dresser, covered in dust and memories forgotten. Inside, we found letters, photographs, and, crucially, a blood-stained handkerchief wrapped around a lock of hair. The sight of it made my stomach churn. "It's enough," Sarah said determinedly. "We have what we need." Back in the living room, we set up the components of the ritual, our hands shaking, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. As Sarah recited the incantation from the diary, the air grew electric, the room pulsating with an ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the board itself. Suddenly, Sarah's voice dropped an octave, blending with the deep, resonant tones of the spirit we had awakened. "Blood for blood, spirit for spirit," she chanted, her eyes rolling back. "You shall not pass beyond this veil." The planchette on the Ouija board moved violently, as if an invisible hand were slamming it down, the letters spelling out furious, scattered words. The walls seemed to pulse with each word, tightening the air around us. Jason reached out to steady Sarah, fear painting his face as he tried to pull her back. "Sarah, stop! You're losing yourself!" But it was too late. The room imploded with supernatural force, propelling us backward and scattering the items we had so carefully arranged. Sarah collapsed, her body limp and motionless, as the board exploded into pieces, an unearthly scream reverberating through the house. For a moment, everything went black. When I awoke, the house was silent. The oppressive air had lifted, but the sense of dread remained. I crawled over to Sarah, relieved to find a pulse, but disconcerted by her unconscious state. Jason helped me lift her onto the couch, his face etched with worry. "Did it work?" he asked, barely able to keep his voice steady. "I don't know," I replied, looking at the shattered remnants of the Ouija board. "But I don't think this is over." The house was still again, but the silence felt temporary, a brief respite before the storm to come. Hours passed, the silence of the house growing thicker, more oppressive. Sarah finally stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she spoke, her voice was a hoarse whisper, filled with confusion and fear. "What happened?" "You performed the ritual," I explained, trying to keep my tone calm and reassuring. "We think it worked, but we need to be sure." Sarah nodded weakly, sitting up with Jason's help. "We should check the attic," she suggested. "If Elias is truly sealed, there shouldn't be any more disturbances." Reluctantly, we agreed. The journey back up the stairs felt longer, each step echoing with our trepidation. When we reached the attic, it was eerily still. The chaotic mess from our earlier scramble remained, but the air had a different quality now, no longer charged with an unseen presence. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped inside, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of Elias. I followed closely, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as I was about to voice my cautious relief, a sudden searing pain shot through my head. I doubled over, clutching my temples as a familiar voice echoed in my mind. "Elias! Elias!" Sarah screamed, and I looked up just in time to see her being lifted off the ground by an invisible force, her body convulsing as if struck by an electric current. Jason and I rushed forward, but an unseen barrier threw us back against the walls, the cold hard wood knocking the wind out of us. "No!" I shouted, struggling to my feet. "Let her go!" The attic vibrated with an unnatural energy, the shadows deepening and twisting into grotesque forms. Elias's voice filled the room, a chilling chorus of anguish and malice. "You cannot seal what is already part of you." Jason clawed his way towards Sarah, his face contorted with determination and fear. "We have to break the link," he shouted. "It's the only way." Desperate and with no other option, I grabbed the fragments of the Ouija board, hoping to dispel the spirit's hold. "Sarah, fight him!" I yelled. "You're stronger than this." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment clarity broke through the pain. With a final defiant scream, Sarah forced out the words of the ritual once more, her voice mingling with Elias's in a cacophony of torment. The attic exploded with light, blinding and overwhelming, as a spectral wind howled through the room. The barrier lifted, and Jason and I rushed to Sarah's side just as she collapsed to the floor, her body limp and lifeless. Panic surged through me as I checked for a pulse, a fleeting moment of hope dashed by the cold stillness of her skin. "No, no, please," Jason sobbed, tears streaming down his face. "Not like this." The house sighed, the oppressive weight lifting from the air. The shadows receded, and for the first time since that night had begun, there was an eerie calm. We sat in the wreckage, the realization of our loss sinking in with crushing finality. Days turned into weeks and life moved on, but nothing felt the same. The tragedy of that night haunted me, a constant reminder of the darkness we had unleashed. I tried to bury the memories, convincing myself it was over, but deep down, I knew it was only the beginning. One cold, moonlit night, as I sat alone in my apartment, a familiar chill seeped into the room. The shadows danced with a life of their own, and the echo of Elias's voice whispered from the corners of my mind. Release, Elias. I looked into the darkened mirror, my reflection staring back with eyes that weren't entirely my own. The haunting presence, once confined to a decrepit attic, had now followed me, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And so I live on, forever haunted by the night we thought it was just a game, knowing that Elias will always be there, waiting, whispering, and ready to find a new vessel. Sometimes the echoes of our past are not just memories, they are voices calling back from the dark. It was nearly midnight when my phone rang, jolting me out of a deep sleep. I groggily reached over to the nightstand, blinking at the unfamiliar number on the screen. Against my better judgment, I answered. Mike? A voice stammered, filled with a desperate urgency that instantly sent chills down my spine. It was Megan, one of my old high school friends. Her voice was almost unrecognizable, a mix of sobs and panicked breaths. Megan? What's wrong? I asked, sitting up and switching on the lamp. It's Jake and Sarah. They're both dead. She choked out, her words barely coherent through her sobs. My heart dropped. Jake and Sarah? Dead? The news hit me like a freight train. Memories of our teenage years flashed through my mind, centering on one night in particular, the night we played with the Ouija board. We used to laugh about it afterward, chalking it up to our wild imaginations. But here was Megan, unraveling on the other end of the line, and I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was horribly wrong. What happened? I demanded, a cold sweat forming on my brow. Accidents. Both of them. Jake died in a car crash last week, and Sarah just 2 days ago. The same way, she managed to say before breaking into more sobs. As the reality of her words sank in, the room felt suddenly colder. I couldn't shake the eerie connection to our past. I knew I had to go back, confront whatever it was we had summoned that night. Megan, we need to meet, I said firmly, already pulling on my jeans and a t-shirt. Our hometown hadn't changed much. The same small coffee shop where we used to hang out still stood on the corner a few blocks away from Sarah's place. I parked my car and walked in, scanning the room for Megan. She sat in the back, her once vibrant eyes now hollow and ringed with dark circles. I could see the haunted look that matched the one I had seen in the mirror that morning. Mike, she said quietly as I approached, her voice barely more than a whisper. Megan, I nodded, taking a seat across from her. The shop's warmth did little to thaw the chill inside me. They weren't just accidents, Mike, she began, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee. I know it has something to do with that night. I let out a deep breath, the weight of her words sinking in. The Ouija board, I stated flatly. She nodded, tears welling up again. We have to go back to Sarah's house. We need to know. Against every logical fiber in my being, I agreed. That basement held too many memories, the kind that scratched at the back of my mind ever since her call. We left the coffee shop in silence, a heavy sense of foreboding hanging over us. Sarah's childhood home stood eerily quiet, as if it were a mausoleum. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, and the house had an air of abandonment, with its chipped paint and broken shutters. Megan had the key. Sarah's parents had entrusted it to her until they settled her affairs. We walked slowly through the house, every creak of the floorboards echoing through the vacant rooms. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, closed but not locked. Megan paused, her hand on the doorknob, her breath shaky. "Are you ready?" she asked, glancing at me with fear-filled eyes. I nodded, though the truth was far from it. "Yes, let's do this." The basement smelled of mold and dust. The darkness seemed almost alive, wrapping around us as we descended the creaky stairs. The old Ouija board sat on a small table in the center, just as we had left it years ago. We lit the candles we had brought, their flickering flames casting wavering shadows on the concrete walls. The board seemed to glow with an unnatural light, a silent promise of the terror we were about to unleash. "Who do you want to contact first?" Megan's voice trembled as she posed the question. "Let's try Jake," I said, my voice steady but my hands shaking. We placed our fingers on the planchette, the small wooden pointer, feeling cold and almost electric under our touch. "Is anyone there?" Megan asked, her voice quivering. "Jake, are you with us?" For a moment, nothing happened. Just when I was about to release the breath I had been holding, the planchette jerked to life. It moved with a frighteningly deliberate speed, spelling out YES. My heart pounded louder than ever as we continued, the basement's temperature seemingly dropping with each letter the planchette revealed. But the next message was the one that made my blood run cold. NOJAKE. Megan gasped, eyes wide with horror. The planchette moved again with a terrifying speed, letters flying beneath our fingers. EAREYOUREADY. The candles flickered wildly as a cold wind seemed to sweep through the basement. Our breaths turned visible in the freezing air. With growing dread, I realized that whatever was communicating with us had been waiting for this moment all along. "We need to stop," I said, my voice breaking. But before Megan could respond, the planchette darted across the board one last time, spelling out a chilling message. ITRICKEYOU. A sense of dread settled over us as we backed away from the board, realizing the entity we had unleashed years ago had only just begun its torment. The air in the basement felt heavy, oppressive. I could see our breath in the frigid room, and my heart thudded painfully in my chest. Megan clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of our hearts. I nodded, and we turned to ascend the creaky stairs. The house seemed to hum with an unseen energy, shadows stretching and contorting in the candlelight. We reached the top of the stairs and closed the basement door behind us, both of us breathing heavily as we tried to push back the sense of overwhelming dread. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There has to be more information out there, someone who knows how to stop this thing." Megan nodded, her expression resolute despite her obvious fear. "I know a place. There's an old occult bookstore downtown. If anyone knows about spirits and Ouija boards, it's the owner." The bookstore was a cramped, dimly lit place, with shelves overflowing with dusty, ancient tomes. The smell of incense and aged paper filled the air. The owner, an elderly man with piercing blue eyes and a long silver beard, looked up as we entered. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gravelly but not unkind. Megan and I exchanged a glance before I stepped forward. "We need information about a spirit we contacted through a Ouija board. It's already claimed the lives of 2 of our friends." The man's eyes darkened, and he beckoned us to follow him to the back of the store. He led us to a small, cluttered office where he motioned for us to sit. "Tell me everything," he said, his gaze intense. We recounted the events of our teenage years and the recent horrors. The man listened without interruption, his face growing graver with each passing moment. "You've encountered a malevolent entity," he said finally, rubbing his temples. "These spirits are ancient, powerful, and extremely dangerous. They thrive on fear and misery. You must take great care." "How do we get rid of it?" Megan asked, desperation evident in her voice. The man sighed deeply. "There are ancient rituals that might help, but they are risky. Such entities do not leave willingly. You'll need to perform the ritual at the place where you first contacted the spirit." The warning settled over us like a dark cloud. With the instructions and a few essential items for the ritual in hand, we left the bookstore and drove back to Sarah's house. The sun had set by the time we arrived, casting long, ominous shadows over the property. As we stepped inside, the house felt even colder than before, the malevolent presence palpable. We made our way to the basement, candles flickering in our hands. The light cast eerie, dancing shadows on the walls, giving the illusion that the darkness was alive and watching us. We set up the items as instructed, creating a makeshift altar in the middle of the basement floor. I could hardly focus, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave, but there was no turning back. Megan began to chant the incantation softly, her voice a fragile thread in the oppressive silence. Suddenly, the room seemed to vibrate, the shadows on the walls twisting and writhing. A low, guttural growl echoed through the space, sending shivers down my spine. Objects around us began to shake, and the candles flickered wildly, as if a gust of wind had swept through the room. "We have to keep going," I shouted over the chaos, trying to steady my trembling hands. Megan's chanting grew louder, more forceful, as the air around us seemed to thicken. The planchette on the Ouija board moved of its own accord, spelling out incoherent messages, and the temperature plummeted further. Abruptly, a loud crash echoed through the basement as an unseen force knocked over a shelf, scattering old tools and debris. Megan screamed, and I felt a rush of adrenaline, my mind a jumbled mix of fear and determination. I grabbed her hand, pulling her away from the falling objects. "We have to finish this," I yelled, clutching the ritual items tightly. Megan nodded, her face pale but resolute. Finally, as the last words of the incantation left her lips, there was a moment of intense stillness. The basement seemed to hold its breath, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. But then, with a bone-chilling howl, the entity made its final stand. The candles extinguished themselves, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, an icy hand gripped my shoulder. I spun around, facing the malevolent spirit's glowing eyes. The overwhelming stench of decay filled the air, and I felt paralyzed with fear. "Megan, run!" I shouted, tearing myself from the spirit's grasp and pushing her towards the stairs. We stumbled through the darkness, the entity's enraged growls and howls echoing behind us. As we reached the top of the stairs, the basement door slammed shut, cutting off the spirit's advance. Panting and shaken, we bolted out of the house and into the night, the cold air a stark contrast to the warmth of our fear-driven flight. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of my car, collapsing into the seats and gasping for breath. "It's not over," Megan whispered, her voice filled with dread. The realization struck me like a punch to the gut. The entity had retreated, but it wasn't banished. We had only angered it further, and its cryptic messages and violent manifestations were far from over, and so the nightmare continued. The drive back to Megan's apartment was tense and silent, both of us weighed down by the impending dread. My mind raced, trying to come up with a new plan. The ritual had failed, and the entity was angrier than ever. As we stepped into her dimly lit living room, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to twitch and reach out toward us. Megan looked exhausted, her eyes darting around the room. "We need to rest," I said, though the words felt hollow. Neither of us would find any real peace tonight. Megan nodded weakly, her face pale and drawn. "I'll try to sleep," she murmured, heading toward her bedroom. I settled on the couch, my mind too restless to consider sleep. I replayed the events over and over, searching for any clue we might have missed. As the hours crept by, the silence of the apartment grew heavier, more oppressive. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream shattered the stillness. I leapt up and rushed to Megan's room, throwing the door open. She was thrashing on the bed, her eyes wide with terror but unseeing, pinned down by an invisible force. "Megan!" I yelled, grabbing her shoulders, trying to pull her free. Her face contorted in pain and fear as she clawed at the air, fighting something only she could see. Then, with a final, heart-wrenching scream, she went limp. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, leaving a suffocating silence. I shook her gently, praying she was just unconscious, but her body remained unresponsive, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. I stumbled back, the room spinning around me. The entity's victory was almost palpable, its malevolent satisfaction filling the air. I realized with a sickening clarity that it had taken Megan as its vessel. Staggering out of the room, I tried to suppress the rising tide of despair. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but I couldn't afford to lose control. There had to be a way to end this. I grabbed the keys and drove aimlessly through the deserted streets, my mind a tangled mess of thoughts and fears. Eventually, I found myself outside the local library. Desperate for any solution, I broke in, heading straight for the occult section. Hours passed as I rifled through old, dusty texts, searching for anything that might help. Finally, I found a mention of an exorcism ritual meant to sever a spirit's connection to its vessel. It was dangerous and required the presence of both the vessel and the one who summoned the spirit. With a grim determination, I gathered the materials listed and headed back to Megan's apartment, the first light of dawn just touching the horizon. I found Megan in the living room, standing unnaturally still, her eyes fixed on me with an eerie calm. "Hello, Mike," she said, though the voice was not entirely hers. It echoed with the spirit's malevolence. "I'm going to end this," I said, setting up the items needed for the exorcism, my hands trembling but resolute. The entity laughed, a chilling sound that made my skin crawl. "You think you can banish me? Foolish." I began the incantation, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. Megan's body convulsed, the entity fighting back with all its might. Objects in the room shook and shattered, the air buzzing with a sinister energy. As I continued chanting, Megan's screams mixed with the spirit's enraged howls. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath in the frosty air. Pain lanced through my head, a psychic attack from the entity, but I pushed through, repeating the incantation louder and stronger. A final, ear-piercing scream filled the apartment as the entity was forcibly expelled from Megan's body. She collapsed, unconscious but alive. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight lifted entirely. I slumped to the floor, exhaustion overwhelming me. The exorcism had worked, but at what cost? Megan was alive, but her mind had endured unimaginable torment. I reached out to touch her hand, offering what little comfort I could. Days passed. Megan regained consciousness but was in a fragile state, her once vibrant spirit now a shadow. I stayed by her side, haunted by whispers and half-formed shadows at the edge of my vision. The entity was gone, but its final message echoed in my mind, a chilling reminder that some scars never heal. Youarenext. Every night, the whispers returned, pulling me into nightmares where reality and the supernatural blurred. I knew that the spirit had left an indelible mark on me. As I sat by Megan's bedside, I realized the true horror we had unleashed, the echo of our past, now an eternal reminder of the darkness that lingers just beyond the veil. I had always been a skeptic, someone who scoffed at supernatural stories and ghostly apparitions. That was until I encountered the Ouija board at a Halloween party in a decrepit old mansion outside our town. The night air was crisp as leaves crunched under our feet. As we approached the mansion, its silhouette loomed ominously against the darkening sky, windows like hollow eyes staring into nothingness. I walked alongside Chris, nervously adjusting the collar of my leather jacket. Sarah and Michael followed, their animated chatter a stark contrast to the sinister setting. "This place gives me the creeps," I muttered, eyeing the crumbling stone facade. Chris laughed, his sandy blonde hair catching the moonlight. "That's the point, Ethan. It's Halloween. What better place for a scare?" We entered the mansion, its vast, empty rooms filled with the scent of aged wood and mildew. Candles flickered in the corners, casting long shadows on the decaying walls. Sarah, a vision of bright colors and braided hair, laid out her backpack's contents, snacks, drinks, and a Ouija board. "I brought it for fun," she said with a mischievous grin. "I've always wanted to try one of these." I rolled my eyes. "You can't be serious. These things are just a load of crap." She shrugged, setting up the board. "Indulge me, Ethan. If nothing happens, you can say I told you so." Chris clapped his hands together. "All right, let's do this." We settled in a circle around the board, our fingertips barely touching the planchette. The light from the candles seemed to dim as we began, the room's temperature plummeting. Sarah initiated with a playful tone. "Is there any spirit here with us tonight?" At first, nothing happened, and I sighed, about to mock the whole charade. But then the planchette began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. It spelled out a single word, "Damned." The laughter died in our throats, replaced by uneasy silence. "Who's there?" Chris asked, his voice now tinged with apprehension. The planchette moved again, Eliza. Sarah's face turned pale. "Eliza was my great-great-grandmother," she whispered, her eyes wide. "She died in this mansion." A cold breeze swept through the room, and the flickering flames on the candles grew taller. The planchette moved with a furious pace, spelling out words like betrayal and murder. We exchanged nervous glances, and the jovial atmosphere was replaced with palpable fear. "This isn't funny, Sarah," I snapped, trying to mask my dread with anger. But Sarah wasn't laughing. Her eyes rolled back, and she began speaking in a voice none of us recognized, deep and filled with sorrow. "I was murdered, betrayed by those I trusted. My spirit cannot rest." We watched helplessly as Sarah convulsed, her body taken over by the tormented spirit. The candles blew out all at once, plunging us into darkness. An unearthly wail filled the room, a sound that seemed to come from the very walls. In the pitch blackness, I heard Sarah's voice, cold and distant. "You brought me back. You cannot leave." Scrambling to find a flashlight, my hands trembled. I shone the light towards where Sarah had been sitting. She was gone. The room was empty save for Chris, Michael, and me, our faces painted with terror. "We need to find her," Chris stammered. His earlier bravado vanished. We stumbled through the mansion's twisting hallways, our flashlights casting eerie shadows that danced on the peeling wallpaper. The house seemed to breathe around us, groaning and creaking as though aware of our presence. "I can't believe this is happening," I muttered, my heart pounding in my chest. "We should have listened to the stories. This place is cursed." Chris nodded, his face drawn tight with fear. "Just focus on finding Sarah. She couldn't have gone far." Room after room, we found no sign of her. Each corner we turned yielded only more darkness and decay. The whispers started low and barely audible. A name drifted through the silence. "Eliza! Eliza!" "I shouldn't have brought the board," Sarah's voice suddenly echoed, her laughter now hollow and detached. "She's here. She's everywhere." A cold metallic touch clasped around my wrist. When I turned my flashlight towards it, nothing was there. Yet the sensation lingered, sending chills down my spine. When we finally reached a large room filled with old portraits and dust-covered furniture, we paused to catch our breath. The sense of dread was suffocating. "Did you hear that?" Chris whispered, his eyes darting around. "There's something in here with us." Before I could respond, an unseen force slammed the door shut, trapping us inside. The room grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, now discernible and mocking. "All of you are trapped," the voice said through the darkness. "None shall leave." The realization hit me hard. We had awakened something malevolent, and it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. And as the weight of our actions settled upon us, the horrifying truth became clear. What started as a game had now become our worst nightmare. Chris banged on the door, desperation seeping into his voice. "We need to get out of here," he shouted, his fists bruising against the thick wood. But it was no use. The walls seemed to close in, the room shrinking with each passing second. A chill raced up my spine as I realized the supernatural force controlling the mansion was toying with us. "Calm down, Chris," I said, though my own voice trembled. "We need to think rationally." "Rational?" Chris whipped around to face me, his eyes wild with fear. Rational went out the window when Sarah started channeling a dead woman. We were interrupted by a soft, eerie humming. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, filling the room with a haunting melody that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. "Sarah," I called out, my voice barely a whisper, but I already knew it wasn't her. The furniture in the room began to shift, scraping against the old wooden floor. An antique chandelier above our heads swayed, casting grotesque shadows that seemed almost alive. Then I saw her. A figure, bathed in a ghostly light, appeared in the far corner of the room. Eliza. Her eyes were hollow pits of darkness, her presence exuding a malevolent energy that made it hard to breathe. "She's here," Chris whispered, backing away slowly. "She's really here." The apparition moved closer, her feet never touching the ground. As she approached, the temperature dropped even further, our breaths becoming visible in the frigid air. She stopped just short of us, and her lips curled into a ghastly smile. "Betrayed? I was betrayed," she hissed, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "And now you shall suffer as I have suffered." Suddenly Chris screamed, his face twisted in agony as unseen hands clawed at him, dragging him toward the wall. I lunged forward to grab him, but my hands passed through his skin as if he were made of mist. The wall seemed to pulsate and absorb him, leaving nothing behind but echoing screams. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Chris!" But he was gone. The room's sinister silence returned, leaving me alone with the spirit. Eliza's gaze bore into me, a chilling promise of what was to come. "You cannot escape this fate," she whispered, fading away into the shadows. I bolted from the room, my mind a whirlwind of panic and dread. The mansion's hallways twisted and turned, each turn leading me deeper into a labyrinth of terror. I had to find Sarah. She was the only one who might know how to stop this. Finally, I stumbled upon a hidden library, the air thick with dust and the scent of ancient paper. Rows of old leather-bound books lined the walls, their spines cracked with age. An ornate writing desk stood in the middle of the room, covered in yellowed, brittle papers. My hand shook as I picked up the documents, old diaries and letters that told the mansion's dark history. Eliza had once been the lady of the house, a woman betrayed by those closest to her. The letters detailed a pact made with dark forces, an attempt to exact revenge that resulted in her own tragic death and her spirit being bound to the Bath mansion. As I read, the room seemed to close in, the shadows deepening. The distant echoes of Eliza's tormented cries filled the space, making it hard to focus. I fumbled through the pages, knowing that somewhere within these records lay the key to ending this nightmare. By the time I found a reference to a possible way to appease her spirit, my hands were cold and heavy with dread. My eyes settled on a name, Sarah. She had to be part of this resolution, her presence essential to ending the curse. Suddenly, the door to the library slammed shut. I spun around to see the room darkening, a familiar presence oozing malevolence. The shadows shifted, and there she was, Sarah, or rather Eliza in her form, standing in the doorway. "You think you can stop me?" Eliza sneered, her voice an unnerving blend of her own and Sarah's. "You are all mine." Before I could react, she lunged at me with inhuman speed, her hands cold as ice clamping around my throat. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw was her chilling smile, echoing the same malevolent promise. Nowhere to run, no escape, ever. My vision returned in waves, the world around me hazy and distorted. I was back in the basement, where it began, surrounded by the same eerie symbols. Sarah, no Eliza, stood before me, her eyes filled with a cold, merciless resolve. My hope faded as I came to terms with the dire reality of my situation. "You've tormented us long enough," I rasped, my throat bruised from Eliza's grip. "What do you want?" Sarah's, or Eliza's, face contorted with both sorrow and fury. She spoke in a voice laced with centuries of pain. "Justice, peace, to make them understand the betrayal that condemned me." "Let Sarah go," I pleaded. "She's innocent. She didn't betray you." "You all played the game," she hissed. "You opened the door. Now it must be shut with blood." Desperate, I racked my mind for anything in the diaries that could help. Eliza had been wronged by those she trusted. Perhaps appealing to her lost humanity could sway her. "I can help you find peace," I said, every word dripping with desperation. "But not like this. Hurting us doesn't change your fate. It only binds you deeper to your hate in this place." There was a flicker in her eyes, a moment of hesitation. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by cold resolve. "Too late for that," she whispered. With a guttural scream, she advanced. But in that split second, I remembered a passage from the diaries about an old ritual meant to lay a spirit to rest. It required the participation of the possessed and a willing soul to plead forgiveness. I realized that the power to stop Eliza lay within Sarah herself. As Eliza lunged, I called out to Sarah. "Sarah, remember who you are. Fighter! You're stronger than this." For a moment, Sarah's eyes flickered, the desperate struggle for control visible in them. Eliza's hold wavered. Seizing the opportunity, I stepped forward, reaching out to my friend. "Sarah, listen to me. She's using your pain, but you can overcome it. We can help her together." Eliza shrieked, her grip on Sarah tightening. But Sarah's spirit was strong. Slowly, recognition returned to her eyes. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice strained, "help me." Together, we began the ancient chant I had glimpsed in the diary. My voice wavered but grew stronger as Sarah joined in, the words foreign but powerful. The basement shook, symbols glowing brightly as the ritual took hold. Eliza's screams filled the air, deafening and desperate. But as the chant reached its crescendo, the light around us intensified, drowning out the dark presence. "Find peace, Eliza," Sarah and I cried out together. "Rest now and let go." With one final, piercing scream, Eliza's presence broke, a gust of cold air rushing through the basement. The symbols faded, and Sarah collapsed into my arms, her body shivering. "It's over," she whispered weakly. But as I held her, another realization dawned. The mansion might be purged of Eliza's vengeance, but the echoes of what happened would linger. The following days felt surreal. We found Chris and Michael outside, unharmed but shaken, their memories a jumbled blur. The mansion, now silent, stood as an eerie reminder of the night's events. Authorities dismissed our stories as hysteria and hallucinations brought on by the dilapidated environment, but we knew better. As days turned into weeks, the weight of the experience never left us. Each creak of an old floorboard, every flicker of a candle set our hearts racing. The shadows seemed to whisper, reminding us of the night we breached the veil between the living and the damned. Years later, as I sit in my apartment, those memories haunt me still. Sarah has moved away, seeking to rebuild a life free from the past's clutches. Chris and Michael drifted, forever altered by what they couldn't recall but couldn't forget either. But I remain, a solitary guardian of a truth too terrifying to embrace. Each night, when darkness falls and silence reigns, the whispers return. You cannot leave, they say, carrying the weight of a promise unfulfilled. In the quiet moments, I still see Eliza's tormented gaze, her longing for justice and peace, a peace we could not entirely grant her. And in those moments, I realize that while the mansion holds the echoes of the damned, they now also reside within us. The night we tempted fate with a Ouija board forever bound us to its relentless shadows. We cannot leave, for some doors, once opened, cannot be shut. You think ghosts are real? Prove it. Those were the words that started it all, spoken by my friend James on a stormy night we'd come to see as thrillingly dangerous. As the rain battered the windows and lightning cracked through the sky, a feeling of foreboding took root in my gut. I should have known that night would test every boundary of my skepticism, but I laughed it off, shaking my head at James's eagerness. James, always the audacious one, thrived on the unexplained. His fascination with ghost stories and the occult often led us on strange adventures. That night, he had convinced me and Lara, our mutual grounding force, to gather at an old, creaky house on the town's edge, the perfect setting for a harmless Ouija board session. As we climbed its rickety steps, the house seemed to groan under the weight of its history, and my skepticism felt almost like an anchor, keeping me from being swept away by the eerie atmosphere. The house's interior was just as I had imagined, dimly lit by flickering candles James had arranged and filled with the musty smell of forgotten memories. Ensconced in the shadows, we settled around the makeshift table with the Ouija board in the center, the wooden planchette sitting still, waiting for contact. I wasn't nervous. Skepticism is a powerful shield against fear, but the thunderous claps outside and the house's groaning timbers made it hard to entirely dismiss the unsettling feeling that crept in. "Ready?" James asked, eyes gleaming with excitement. "Let's just get this over with," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Lara, true to form, gave him an exasperated look, though I could see a glint of reluctant curiosity in her eyes. We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, James whispering a few words meant to invite any spirits present to communicate with us. My mind wandered, already concocting explanations for any movements as subconscious muscle twitches or coincidental answers. At first, nothing happened. We sat in the candlelit stillness, the only sounds coming from the storm outside. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. James's eyes lit up, while Lara and I exchanged skeptical glances. "Who's here with us tonight?" James asked, his voice just above a whisper. The planchette hesitated before sliding to the letters E and V. "Ev, is that your name?" James probed, his excitement barely contained. Lara shifted uncomfortably, and I sighed. This all seemed too elementary, too theatrical. But then the planchette zoomed to spell event. "This is absurd," I muttered, trying to mask a sudden, inexplicable chill that crept up my spine. "What event?" Lara asked, her voice tinged with genuine curiosity now. "END," the board spelled out. Before I could scoff, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and an eerie silence settled over us, thick and suffocating. Then came the whispers, faint and just beyond the reach of understanding, echoing through the ancient wood of the house. Lara's eyes widened, and even James looked taken aback. The shutters rattled violently against the wind, making the whispers seem more urgent, more desperate. "What do you want?" I asked, my skepticism now warring with a growing sense of dread. The planchette moved deliberately this time, spelling out ETERNITY. "We need more light," Lara said, her voice trembling. James fumbled to increase the candlelight, the tiny flames casting grotesque shadows that danced menacingly on the walls. The whispers grew louder, now infused with a palpable sense of urgency and anger. "Ethan, what is happening?" Laura's voice cracked, echoing my own jumbled thoughts. It's just our minds playing tricks, I offered weakly, but the chill in the room and the growing sense of an unseen presence told another story. The storm outside seemed to rage harder, mirroring the unseen turmoil within the house. The whispers became a haunting symphony, circling us, each soft murmur a stroke of fear against our bravado. "What do we do now?" James asked, looking to me for once, the excitement replaced by uncertainty. "We keep going," I said, trying to hold on to the fraying edges of my skepticism. "Let's see what it wants." But deep down, I already feared that we might have reached out to something far beyond our understanding, a force that, once stirred, would not easily go back to sleep. As we prepared to ask another question, I couldn't shake the feeling that the night was about to get far darker than any of us had imagined. The planchette quivered under our fingers, then shot towards the letters with alarming speed. "Y-O-U. You? You what?" I asked, my voice wavering. The room felt different now, heavy with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. "S-I-N, the board spelled out. "You sin?" Lara repeated, confusion etched on her face. Or, "We sin?" The planchette moved again, this time even faster. "B-L-O-O-D. A cold shiver ran down my spine. "This is getting out of hand, James," I warned, but he was too absorbed to hear me. "Whose blood? What do you mean?" James asked, eyes wide. The room seemed to grow colder with each second, and I noticed Lara's hands trembling beside mine. The board spelled out a name this time, L-A-R-A. Lara flinched, pulling her hands away from the board as if it had burnt her. "What does it want with me?" she whispered, eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, but we need to find out," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Why Lara?" I asked the board. The answer came quickly, almost impatiently. "F-A-M-I-L-Y. Lara stared at the board, her face pale. "Family? What does my family have to do with this?" "I think it's trying to say that the blood sin is related to your family," James said, his voice now tinged with uncertainty. Suddenly, the candles flickered violently as a gust of cold wind swept through the room. Whispers became louder, more insistent, circling us like a sinister chant. My heart pounded in my chest as an invisible pressure began to squeeze the room, making it hard to even think. "I need a break," Lara said, standing up abruptly. She backed away from the table, her eyes darting around as if she could see the source of the whispers. "Lara, wait," I called, but she was already out of the room, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the old house. James and I exchanged worried glances. "Should we stop?" he asked, uncharacteristically hesitant. "No," I said, feeling a stubbornness rise within me. "We need answers. We can't just leave it like this." We continued without Lara, the air between us taut with tension. "What do you want from Lara's family?" James asked, his voice barely steady. The planchette moved deliberately this time. "J-U-S-T-I-C-E. "Justice for what?" I asked, the word reverberating in my mind like a struck bell. The board was silent for a moment, then it spelled out, B-E-T-R-A-Y-A-L. Before we could probe further, we heard a loud crash from another room. James and I jumped to our feet, our adrenaline spiking as we rushed towards the sound. We found Lara standing in front of an old shattered mirror, her hands shaking. "I saw something in the mirror," she stammered. "A face. It wasn't mine." James placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We need to figure out what's going on. Maybe the local library has something, records or history about the house and your family." Despite her reluctance, Lara agreed, and we found ourselves scouring through dusty records at the local library the next morning. The oppressive weight of the previous night clung to us, but we pushed forward, desperate for answers. Hours passed as we sifted through old newspapers and historical documents. Finally, we found it, an article detailing a gruesome event from over a century ago. A family, Lara's ancestors, had owned the house and been involved in a scandalous betrayal, leading to the death of a once trusted friend. The vengeful spirit seeking justice was none other than Elizabeth, a wronged family member who had been betrayed and left to die. As we read the details, everything fell into place. The spirit E was Elizabeth, seeking retribution for the betrayal inflicted upon her. The patterns of behavior, the whispers, the cold presence, it all made a horrific kind of sense now. Just as we began to digest this revelation, Lara received a text from James, who had gone back to his house to get some supplies. It was a single, chilling sentence. "I think it's in my house." Racing back to James's place, we found him shaken and bruised. He described a series of inexplicable accidents, books flying off shelves, objects moving on their own, and an oppressive, invisible force pushing him down the stairs. "James, are you okay?" I asked, inspecting a nasty gash on his forehead. "I don't know, Ethan. I think she's coming after us now," he said, eyes wide with fear. "We need to end this," Lara said, her voice faltering but determined. "We have to go back to the house tonight," I said. "It's the only way to confront her and put this to rest." As we prepared for the final confrontation, no one spoke of the underlying fear that gnawed at us. The fear that we might be facing a force far beyond our ability to reason or control. The storm was raging when we arrived back at the old house, the wind howling through the trees like a chorus of lost souls. Lara clutched a flashlight tightly, its beam cutting through the inky darkness that seemed to bleed from every corner of the house. James carried a bundle of supplies, candles, matches, a notepad, and a few protective talismans he'd quickly acquired in his panicked search for safety. "This is it," I said, my voice firm despite the dread gnawing at my insides. "We confront her. We end this." We set up our seance in the same room, the familiarity now twisted with layers of fear and anxiety. The candles flickered to life once more, casting long, wavering shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The planchette was waiting, an ominous sentinel. "Elizabeth," I called out, "we're here to understand, to make things right." The temperature dropped instantly, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. The planchette began to move on its own, without our fingers guiding it. "WHY?" it spelled. "Because you deserve justice," Lara said, her voice shaking, "but we need to know how to give it to you." The air became charged, static building until it felt like the room might explode. The candles flickered wildly, and then, in a flash of brilliance, she was there. Elizabeth, or rather a swirling, transparent figure that we could only perceive as her, stood before us. "You betrayed me," she hissed, her voice echoing with centuries of rage, her eyes fixed on Lara with a look of intense loathing. "It wasn't us," Lara cried out. "We are not our ancestors." Elizabeth's form wavered, almost as if considering Lara's plea, but the malevolent energy in the room spiked, and objects around us began to lift and spin in a chaotic dance of fury. "You must understand," I shouted over the din. "We are here to make amends. Tell us what you need." Elizabeth's figure solidified, eyes burning with a cold fire. "Suffering," she spat. "They must suffer as I suffered." "What do you mean?" James asked, desperation lining his voice. In a horrifying vision, Elizabeth showed us what had happened, the betrayal, the torture, the slow, agonizing death she endured. The air grew heavier, pressing down on us as though the house itself were suffocating us with its history. "We can't change the past," I said softly, stepping forward. "But we can honor your pain. We can make sure your story is never forgotten." Elizabeth's eyes bore into me, and for a moment I felt her agony, the deep, unrelenting betrayal. It was almost too much to bear, almost enough to break my spirit. "Swear it," she demanded. "Swear on your bloodline." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my words. "I swear, on my bloodline and my heritage, that your story will be told. We will ensure your memory lives on, that your suffering will not be in vain." There was a pause, a stillness that felt both eternal and fleeting. The oppressive energy lifted slightly, and Elizabeth's form seemed to waver, her anger dimming. "Your mark," she said finally. "Show it, forever remember me." I braced myself, knowing this was not a simple request. Elizabeth extended a spectral hand, and an icy pain seared through my skin. I bit back a scream as a symbol. An intricate ancient mark appeared on my forearm, brilliant and glowing before fading to a deep, permanent scar. The room's temperature started to normalize, the floating objects settling back into their places. Elizabeth's form began to dissipate, the edges of her figure softening as she slowly faded from sight. "Thank you," Lara whispered, tears streaming down her face. Elizabeth's eyes seemed to soften just for a moment before she finally vanished, leaving behind an echo of whispers that steadily faded into silence. We sat in the newfound quiet, the storm outside seeming less malevolent, more like a heavy rain that had washed away centuries of torment. "You did it," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "No," I said, looking at the mark on my arm, still tingling with an unearthly sensation. "We did it." As we gathered our things and prepared to leave the old house, a somber but lighter feeling settled over us. The house, once a place of endless suffering, seemed to have released its grip on the past, set free by our pledge to remember and honor Elizabeth's story. The ride back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. We had survived, but we were changed. The mark on my arm would forever be a reminder of the night we faced the darkness and made peace with a vengeful spirit. We returned to our lives, but none of us were ever the same again. James dove deeper into the occult, now with a respect for the power he had once only toyed with. Lara became an advocate for exploring family histories, helping others understand and unearth their pasts. And I, marked and eternally linked to Elizabeth, lived with the constant reminder of that stormy night, knowing that we had bridged the gap between past and present and brought some semblance of justice to a restless soul. In the end, the real horror wasn't the haunting, but the depth of suffering that time had tried to bury. And as we learned, some stories refuse to be forgotten. It started as a joke, an innocent attempt to debunk ghosts and spirits, but by the time we realized the gravity of our actions, it was too late. Lydia had arrived, and she wasn't leaving. The musty attic of my grandmother's house hadn't seen daylight in decades. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that filtered through the cracked windows. My friends and I had decided to explore the attic out of sheer boredom. After all, there wasn't much else to do in this sleepy town. Amid the cobwebs and forgotten relics of the past, we unearthed an old Ouija board hidden beneath piles of yellowed newspapers and vintage clothes. "Hey, check this out!" Mark's voice echoed through the attic, breaking the silence. His eyes gleamed with a mixture of excitement and mischief as he waved the board in front of us. Emily, slightly more cautious, hesitated. "Are you sure that's a good idea? I mean, those things are supposed to be spooky, right?" I shrugged, more amused than concerned. "Come on, Emily. It's just a piece of wood. What's the worst that could happen?" We set up in the living room, dimming the lights and lighting a few candles for effect. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the walls, adding an eerie touch to our makeshift seance. I, Chris, was determined to prove that this was all nonsense, just another superstition meant to scare the gullible. "Everyone ready?" I asked, positioning my hands on the planchette. Mark and Emily followed suit, their fingers lightly resting on the wooden piece. For a moment we sat there in silence, the air thick with anticipation. I decided to break the ice. "Is there anyone here who wishes to speak with us?" I enunciated each word clearly, suppressing a smirk. At first, nothing happened. I could feel the skepticism in the room, almost like a tangible presence. It seemed the board would do little more than collect dust once again. But then, the planchette began to move, slowly at first, almost hesitant. "Tss, tss." Emily gasped, her fingers trembling. "That's your name, Chris." I raised an eyebrow, still unconvinced. Lucky guess, but the planchette didn't stop there. It continued, spelling out words that chilled us to the bone. All-Y-E'd. We exchanged uneasy glances. It was growing harder to dismiss this as mere coincidence. "Who are you?" Mark asked, his voice shaky now. The planchette once again began its deliberate journey across the board. Lydia. The name seemed to hang in the air, heavy and oppressive. Lydia. A name that had no significance to us at the time, but would soon change our lives forever. Later that night, as we tried to shake off the disturbing experience, I retreated to my room in weary disbelief. It was just a game, I told myself. But the dreams that followed were anything but playful. In the dream, a woman with sad eyes and outstretched hands called for me. Forgotten rooms and bloody walls haunted my sleep, and her voice, Lydia's voice, was as clear as day. The next morning, dark circles under my eyes, I tried to piece together what had happened. My rational mind sought explanations, but the fear gnawed at my sanity. At breakfast, Emily looked equally haggard. Did any of you dream about her?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded. Yes, it felt so real. Mark's usual bravado was gone, replaced by a pale, haunted look. Me too. She kept saying she was betrayed. It was like I was there with her. Despite the growing dread, I couldn't let go of my need for answers. We decided to use the board again, this time with more caution and a desire not just for thrills, but understanding. We lit the candles and settled back into our ominous gathering spot. "Why are you here, Lydia?" Emily asked, her voice betraying the fear she tried to mask. The planchette moved more quickly now, as though Lydia had been waiting for us. The words came faster than we could keep up, filling us with a terror that was almost palpable. This was no longer a game. Later that night, as I reluctantly climbed into bed, exhausted, but too wired to sleep, I tried to rationalize the day's events. My analytical mind wanted to solve the puzzle, but the unsettling whisper in my head, Lydia's voice, warned that some mysteries are better left unsolved. It wasn't long before I was caught in a vicious cycle of nightmares and half-wakeful musings, walking the thin line between reality and the supernatural. The nightmare clung to me like a second skin, even in the daylight. The following day, I found myself at the local library, our town's repository of history. Its archaic scent of aging paper and wood provided a temporary comfort. I was on a mission to uncover Lydia's past, hoping that understanding her story might give us some control over our situation. Poring over old records and newspaper clippings, I unearthed fragments of a tragic tale. Lydia had lived in our town over a century ago. She was a young woman wrongly accused of a crime she didn't commit. The articles hinted at her wrongful death, a public execution that had torn families apart and left a scar on the town's history. My breath hitched when I found a mention of my great-grandfather, implicated in the events leading to Lydia's demise. The strings of fate binding us to Lydia became more evident, yet deeply disturbing. Displaying my findings, I reconvened with Mark and Emily later that evening. The expressions on their faces swung between horror and disbelief as I relayed the grim narrative. "We need to figure this out, to free her," I concluded, the weight of our actions heavy on my shoulders. Desperation led us back to the Ouija board, hoping to communicate more solemnly with Lydia. In the dim candlelight, we asked her what we could do to atone for our ancestors' sins. The planchette moved swiftly, as if Lydia had been waiting all along. Oof. Mark's hands trembled. What does she mean? How can we free her? A chilling gust of wind extinguished the candles, plunging us into darkness. Our breaths quickened, eyes wide as we struggled to relight the wicks. When light returned, we found a series of objects, ancient coins, a rusted key, and a torn piece of parchment scattered around us, items that seemed to have materialized out of nowhere. Shaken but resolute, we took these items, realizing they might be part of a ritual Lydia needed us to complete. Despite our newfound fear, we pressed onwards. We had to finish what we had started. The events escalated. Each one of us began experiencing terrifying occurrences that couldn't be ignored. Mark was the first to encounter the malevolent escalation. Alone at home, he heard murmurs that grew louder, a cacophony of despairing voices echoing through his empty halls. Shadows flickered and elongated unnaturally, stretching fingers that seemed to grasp at him. The boiling fear was nearly too much to bear, and in a moment of sheer terror, Mark crashed through the living room, knocking over furniture until he found himself cornered. Mark called me, his voice a strained whisper filled with fear. "Chris, she's here. Lydia's here. I can't be alone. Please, get over here." I rushed over with Emily, feeling dread creep through my veins. When we arrived, we found Mark with a deep gash on his arm, likely a result of his desperate attempts to flee from the phantoms that haunted him. The sight of Mark's injury quelled any remaining skepticism within us. We now understood the extent of Lydia's torment and our place at the heart of it. We decided to attempt the ritual that very night. We returned to the old house, assembling everything we believed Lydia had left us for. Mark's bloodied bandage was a stark reminder of our perilous journey as we prepared the ceremony in the garden, hoping to evoke a sense of sanctity. We performed the incantations we had found, our voices shaking but unified in resolution. As we placed the final object, a rusty key, into the center of our makeshift altar, a powerful wind surged. The flames of our candles danced wildly, casting erratic shadows that felt almost alive. We completed the final words of the ritual, expecting the oppressive weight to lift, but instead, everything intensified. A deafening silence followed the gust, and for a moment, it felt as if the world itself had paused. Then they came, the whispers. Not just Lydia's anymore, but countless others. Their spectral voices filled the air with sorrow and rage. It was clear our ritual had failed. Instead of freeing Lydia, we had only drawn more spirits into our reality. My heart pounded as I realized that what we had unleashed was far beyond our understanding or control. Racing back to the living room, the urgency of the situation washed over us. Emily's eyes glistened with tears. Mark clutched his arm, and I was engulfed in a tempest of guilt and fear. We huddled together, seeking comfort as the spirit's whispers grew denser, flowing into an overwhelming chorus that seemed intent on driving us mad. The oppressive weight of our failure left us grasping at straws. Desperation drove us to perform another ritual, one I had uncovered in an old text buried deep within the local library's archives. The instructions were vague but hinted at something more powerful than anything we had attempted before. It spoke of a final desperate attempt to break the chains binding Lydia and the other spirits. We gathered in an abandoned churchyard on the outskirts of town, its ruins illuminated by flashes of lightning from the approaching storm. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, arriving as if the heavens themselves were aware of what we were about to do. The ancient trees surrounding the church swung like specters in the wind, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The ritual's intensity pierced our composure as we placed the Ouija board on a stone altar and arrayed the ancient items around it. We lit candles, their flames struggling to stay alive in the downpour. Feelings of fear and determination churned within us as we chanted the incantations. Lydia, hear us. We seek to free you. We offer this sacrifice in good faith. The storm raged as our voices echoed through the abandoned churchyard, almost swallowed by the wind. Emily placed her palm over the planchette, her fingers trembling. Mark followed, despite the blood soaking his makeshift bandage. I joined last, praying that this final act would bring peace. As we completed the chant, a piercing shriek filled the air, cutting through the storm. Shadows coalesced into human shapes, and we found ourselves surrounded by translucent figures. Men, women, children, all with expressions of torment and despair. Lydia was among them, her eyes locking onto mine with a pleading intensity. Suddenly she spoke, her ethereal voice clear and resonant amidst the chaos. The pact demands a soul, a life willingly given to balance the scales. My eyes widened in terror as her words sunk in. The ritual required a true sacrifice, an actual life for life. For a moment, everything became eerily still. From the corner of my eye, I saw Emily and Mark grapple with the horrifying realization. Emily's tears mingled with the rain on her face as she turned to me, her expression reflecting the same dread. The weight of what had to be done became unmistakably clear. Before any of us could react, a blinding flash of lightning struck the altar, engulfing everything in brilliant white light. When it subsided, the ghosts, Lydia included, seemed even more tangible, their presence suffocating. As the spirit's wails grew deafening, reaching a fever pitch, we knew we had no other options. We staggered backwards, our hope dissolved into despair. There was no reasoning with Lydia now. The pact demanded its due, and we were powerless to change its terms. Defeated, we fled the churchyard, the weight of the spectral eyes following us into the storm. When we reached the safe confines of the house, something inside me shattered. The constant whispers, the creeping shadows, they had become permanent fixtures in our lives. Days turned into weeks. The hauntings evolved but never ceased. We were no longer just a group of friends bound by an experience. We were marked, shadowed by the consequences of an ancient sin. Lydia's face haunted my dreams, while her whispers surged in every dark corner of my waking hours. Emily, once a beacon of hope, withdrew into herself, her artistic talents now tainted with the darkness we had invited. Mark grew increasingly paranoid, his injuries healing but his mind splintering under the relentless stress. One night, as I lay awake listening to the incessant whispers, I felt reality slip further from my grasp. There was no escape. We had become permanent conduits for the aggrieved spirits, a living testament to the horror we had unleashed. My skepticism had been replaced by an unending nightmare, and I grasped the grim truth. Some mysteries are indeed better left unsolved. The finality of our fate settled deep within me. Lydia and the others would never find peace, and neither would we. Our curiosity had opened a door to another realm, and it refused to close, leaving us forever entangled in a spectral loop of sorrow and despair. Somnia, a name whispered in shadows, a pact made in jest. not all games are meant to be played. I can't shake the feeling that writing this down might be my last tether to sanity. It all started 5 years ago, in the dimly lit basement of my friend Greg's house. It was one of those typical teenage get-togethers where we pushed boundaries and sought cheap thrills. We were 16, drunk on cheap beer, and daring each other to take it up a notch. That's when Claire, always the thrill seeker, pulled an old wooden box from her backpack. Greg, Claire, and I shared the restless energy of youth, looking for a thrill on a night that had grown too mundane. Claire opened the box with a dramatic flair, revealing an old Ouija board. The air thickened with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. None of us really believed in the supernatural, but the promise of scaring ourselves silly was too tempting to pass up. We gathered around the table, our faces eerily illuminated by the flickering basement light. The board had been Claire's grandmother's, a relic from another era, the letters faded and the planchette worn smooth by time. We arranged it in the center, our fingers grazing the edges of the planchette with a mix of nervous laughter and anticipation. "What should we ask?" Claire's voice cut through the semi-darkness, her usual boldness tinged with hesitation. Greg, never one to waste an opportunity for bravado, scoffed. "Is there anyone here with us?" He challenged the empty air. The planchette began to move, slowly circling the board. Nervous giggles turned into gasps as it settled on YES. We exchanged uneasy looks but continued. Greg, emboldened, asked another question. "What's your name?" "SOMNIA," the board spelled out. We fell silent, goosebumps erupting on my arms. None of us recognized the name, but it felt wrong, unsettling, like an itch you can't scratch. Feeling a dark thrill, Greg leaned in closer. "What do you want?" The planchette hesitated, then spelled TIME. "What the hell does that mean?" I asked, hoping someone would laugh it off. Instead, we just stared at each other, a collective shiver running down our spines. "Let's make a pact with it," Greg suggested, half joking, half serious. It was the kind of dare that 5 minutes earlier would have gotten a laugh. In the eerie stillness of the basement, after witnessing the board's movements, it felt like stepping off a cliff. We placed our fingers on the planchette once more, in unison, our voices trembling as we said, "We offer you our time." The basement clock struck midnight just as we closed the session. A wave of relief washed over us, breaking the tension. We laughed it off, convincing ourselves it was just a prank or our collective imagination. 5 years later, life went on. School, college, relationships. The Ouija board night became a distant memory, a story to scare new friends with. But the dreams started, disturbing, vivid nightmares where Somnia whispered our names in dark corners of our minds, demanding the time we had pledged. We stopped talking about it, as if silence could make it disappear. That tenuous silence shattered when I received a panicked call from Claire. Greg was dead. I rushed to his house, my mind refusing to accept the reality of her words. When I arrived, the scene was a nightmare. Greg's body lay crumpled at the foot of the stairs, his face twisted in an expression of pure terror. The police were everywhere, but it was clear what had happened. Sleepwalking, they said. I stood beside Claire, the weight of the situation pressing on us. "He hadn't been sleeping," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Dark circles, always tired. He said Somnia wouldn't let him rest." A chill ran down my spine. The insane, impossible reality of our pact crashed down on me. We were tied to something beyond our understanding, and it had now claimed its first victim. Greg's death forced us to face the horrifying truth. We realized our only hope was to confront the source of our nightmares. In some desperate attempt to save ourselves, we gathered again in Greg's basement. The familiar, unsettling atmosphere reemerged, the Ouija board at the center of our fears. "Let's try to end this," Claire said, her bravado replaced by raw, palpable fear. We placed our fingers on the planchette once more, our hearts pounding in unison. "What do you want from us?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The planchette moved almost instantly. YOURTIM, it spelled. Suddenly, the light bulb overhead shattered, plunging the room into an unnerving darkness. The air grew colder, and I felt something brush against my shoulder, like an icy hand. A whisper echoed in my ear, words that made my blood run cold. Somnia had come for us. We couldn't escape the time we had recklessly pledged, and it was collecting, minute by horrifying minute. Since that night, fear has become my constant companion. I can't sleep. I don't dare to. Somnia lingers in the shadows, in every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the night wind. Every fleeting moment of rest is plagued by horrific visions. The specter of Somnia creeps into my subconscious, turning dreams into a battleground of terror. I know the others feel it too. We've all been reduced to shadows of our former selves, haggard and worn from sleepless nights. It's as though Somnia is feeding on our exhaustion, growing stronger as we grow weaker. The group that once found solace in each other's company now finds only strained silence and fearful glances. Our friendship, once a source of strength, has become another casualty of our pact. A week after our terrifying encounter in Greg's basement, Claire calls us back together. Her voice is different now, tinged with the desperation of someone clinging to the last threads of hope. We gather at her apartment, hoping against hope that we can find a solution. Maybe we missed something, Claire suggests, her eyes sunken and red. We need to gather more information about Somnia, try to find a way to break the pact. We spend hours combing through old books, searching online forums, and even visiting a local occult shop. The shop owner, an elderly woman with piercing eyes, listens skeptically as we pour out our story. Finally, she sighs and gives us a name, an old grimoire that might hold the answers we seek. In our exhausted state, it feels like a lifeline. But hope soon turns to frustration, as every lead is a dead end. The more we search, the more we feel Somnia's grip tightening. Paranoia sets in, and our nerves fray. Every shadow looks like a threat, every creak in the night a harbinger of doom. Desperation drives us back to our old haunt. We gather once more in Greg's dark and dusty basement. The musty air clings to our clothes, adding to the weight of doom surrounding us. The Ouija board waits, a silent reminder of our folly. We join hands, our fingers trembling as they touch the planchette. "We have to try again," Claire says, her voice a fragile whisper. "We need to end this." The planchette slides beneath our fingers with unnerving speed. Messages come through rapidly, cryptic phrases and symbols that only deepen our fear. The sensation that we are not alone grows overwhelming. Unseen hands brush against us, cold whispers caress our ears, and the shadows seem to move of their own accord. Our only respite is the dim glow of the basement light, but even that seems to flicker ominously. The message from Somnia is clear, Yourtime. And then it happens. We lose power. The feeble light dies out with a final spark, plunging us into complete darkness. Panic sets in, because we know that in the darkness, Somnia lurks. I feel a cold, icy hand grip my shoulder, sending a wave of terror through my body. Voices whisper in my ear, the words unintelligible but filled with malice. We scream, breaking our circle and scrambling for our phones to create some semblance of light. The darkness feels alive, closing in on us with malevolent intent. We flee the basement, bursting into the safety of the night air, but the feeling of dread follows us. It's clear that there's no escaping Somnia's reach. Days turn into restless, harrowing nights. I barely recognize myself in the mirror anymore. My hazel eyes are bloodshot, surrounded by dark circles. I've grown thin, my once lean muscles now weak from lack of sleep. The haunting dreams have become more vivid, more violent. Somnia visits me every night, demanding the time we pledged. Arguments start to fracture our group. We blame each other, the stress and fear eroding what remains of our bond. Claire tries to mediate, but her hopeful demeanor has transformed into fraught desperation. Greg's death looms over every conversation, a grim reminder of what awaits us. One night, the tension reaches a breaking point. Accusations fly. Claire accuses another friend of sabotaging their research. The friend retorts that it's Claire's fault for bringing the Ouija board in the first place. I try to intervene, but my own anger bubbles to the surface. "You're all acting like children," I shout, my voice cracking. "We're in this together whether we like it or not. Fighting isn't going to save us." But deep down, a seed of doubt has been planted. Could one of us really be responsible for making things worse? Were there other secrets hidden in that fateful night? Our small group, once united, now stands on the brink of collapse. The paranoia and fear Somnia feeds off have taken root in our hearts. I can't help but wonder if we're already too late to save ourselves. The sleepless nights stretch into a blur of fear and paranoia. Every waking moment is a battle to stay sane as the grip of Somnia tightens. With no other option, I dive headfirst into research, letting the search for answers consume the little energy I have left. One evening, while scouring the university library, I stumble upon an obscure reference to Somnia in an old dusty tome. Hidden in the back, it's a journal from the early 1900s belonging to an occult researcher who documented strange occurrences linked to a malevolent entity named Somnia. My breath catches as I read the final entry. It speaks of a group who made a pact with Somnia, offering their time. Each member suffered a fate worse than death, haunted by the entity until their last breath. But buried within the text is a hint of something more, a snippet of a conversation copied verbatim. The researcher had mentioned a way to confront Somnia, buried in the cryptic language of an ancient rite. Driven by desperation, I visit Claire's apartment to share my findings. Our friends gather once more, hollow-eyed and shaking, but united by a fragile thread of hope. We pore over the journal together, the weight of each passing minute pressing down on us. "There's an old chapel," Claire says, pointing to a map found within the journal. "It's abandoned now, but it used to be a place of ritual." We arrive at the chapel by nightfall, the building a haunting silhouette against the starlit sky. Inside, it's as if time itself has forgotten the place, dust and decay clinging to every surface. We set up in the chapel's cold, echoing hall, arranging candles in a circle and placing the Ouija board in the center. It feels wrong to be here, invoking ancient rites we barely understand, but we're out of options. We join hands, our mutual fear binding us tighter than ever before. We start the ritual, following the instructions in the journal. The candles flicker madly, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The air grows colder, and the feeling of being watched becomes overpowering. The planchette moves faster now, almost violently. It's as if Somnia knows we're trying to break free. With bated breath, we demand answers, invoking the old language of the ritual. "Why are you doing this to us?" I shout, desperation cracking my voice. The response is immediate and chilling. "Yourtimesmine." The ground beneath us trembles, and a spectral wind extinguishes the candles, plunging us into darkness. Claire screams, and I can feel the cold, oppressive presence of Somnia creeping closer, its whispers filling our minds. Suddenly, it feels as though the shadows themselves are pressing in around us, suffocating us with their malevolence. The journal's pages rustle violently, flipping open to a final hidden note. In a desperate flash of light from my phone, I glimpse the words, "There must be a willing sacrifice to break the pact." Understanding dawns upon us with grim finality. One of us has to offer ourselves to keep the others safe. The realization sends a wave of dread washing over the group. Claire's eyes meet mine, and I can see her resignation. "I'll do it," she whispers, the words almost lost in the howling wind. "I brought the board. This is my fault." "Claire, no!" I reach for her, but she steps into the circle, her face steeled with determination. In the darkness, Claire addresses Somnia directly, offering herself in place of our collective time. The shadows seem to recoil, and for a moment there's an eerie silence. Then the grip upon us loosens, the oppressive weight lifting as Somnia claims its prize. The chapel stills, and the air grows lighter. Claire collapses, and though her body remains, her spirit feels distant, as though already claimed by the malevolent entity. Tears stream down my face as I kneel beside her, the weight of her sacrifice washing over me. My friends gather around, the heavy silence a testament to the gravity of the moment. Claire's slow, labored breaths are the only sound, a haunting reminder of the price we've paid. In that moment, I understand the finality of our actions. Somnia may no longer lay claim to our time, but we are irrevocably scarred by the ordeal. Claire's sacrifice is our only salvation, and as her breaths grow shallower, I realize that we must honor her, ensuring this story is never forgotten so no one repeats our mistake. We leave the chapel, carrying Claire's memory and the weight of our actions. Sleep does not come easily, but when it does, it is free from the haunting whispers of Somnia. I document everything, every harrowing detail, hoping to warn others. Not all games are meant to be played. Not all pacts should be made. And as we walk away, I know we will never be the same. Some nightmares linger long after waking. The whispers started after that night. No matter how far I ran, they followed, an endless echo of the darkness we unleashed. It all began with just a flickering candle and an unanswered childhood promise. It was a typical Friday night, the kind of evening where the mundanity of our small town drove us to find excitement in the most unconventional ways. Jim, always the instigator, showed up with an old Ouija board he claimed to have found in his grandmother's attic. With his skeptical grin, he dared us to give it a try. We gathered in his basement, a place filled with relics from our years of friendship. Posters of bands we no longer listened to adorned the walls, and the familiar, worn-out couch welcomed us as we settled in. The basement, dimly lit by flickering candles, carried an air of forgotten memories and hidden secrets. Laura sat cross-legged next to me, her long, wavy black hair cascading over her shoulders. She fiddled with a necklace that had a small glass vial dangling from it, a keepsake from her grandmother. Jim, towering over us with his muscular build, spread out the Ouija board on the coffee table. Katie, her expressive eyes darting around nervously, adjusted the candles to cast an even glow. The anticipation hung thick in the air, a mix of excitement and trepidation. "All right, everyone," Jim said, his voice steady and confident. "Let's see if there really is anything to this." We placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, the smooth wood cool to the touch. Jim started with a few harmless questions, the kind you'd ask at a slumber party to spook your friends. We laughed and teased, our nerves masked by bravado. "Is anyone there?" Jim asked, his tone mocking. For a moment, nothing happened. Just as we started to relax, the planchette jerked slightly. We exchanged glances. "Stop messing around," Jim said, eyeing each of us. But there was an undercurrent of unease in his voice. Against our better judgment, we continued. The planchette moved again, this time more deliberately, spelling out YES. Katie's hand trembled visibly. "I must be imagining things," she whispered. "This can't be real." Laura, ever the spiritual one, suggested, "Maybe we should ask who we're speaking to." Jim nodded, taking a deep breath. "Who are you?" The planchette moved with a fluidity that made my skin crawl. "Lucy." Katie went pale, her breath hitching. That's my grandma's name," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The basement grew colder, and the flickering of the candles seemed more erratic. A heavy silence descended upon us, broken only by the sound of our shallow breaths. Something felt undeniably wrong. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jim pressed on. "What do you want, Lucy?" The planchette moved again, each letter sending a shiver down my spine. TRUSTNOONE. Katie's eyes welled with tears. "I don't understand," she said, looking around desperately. "What does she mean?" Jim, now visibly shaken but unwilling to let it show, tried to rationalize. "Someone here is playing a sick joke." But the board had already changed the atmosphere around us. The room felt heavier, the shadows more ominous. Before we could decide on our next move, the planchette moved on its own, spelling out JM. The color drained from Jim's face. "What the hell?" he muttered. Laura's voice wavered as she asked, "What do you want with Jim?" The response came swiftly, as if the spirit had been waiting. "He brokehispros." Jim looked like he had seen a ghost. "I don't know what this is about," he stammered, but his eyes betrayed him. "What's she talking about?" Laura asked, her voice edged with fear. Jim took a deep breath, his bravado crumbling. "When I was a kid, I promised my grandma Lucy that I'd always keep her antique collection safe. But I sold it after she passed to pay off some debts." The planchette moved violently, spelling out a single word that sent chills down my spine. LIAR. Katie sobbed openly now, clutching her grandmother's necklace. Jim's face was a mixture of guilt and confusion. Laura whispered a prayer under her breath, her eyes squeezed shut. Suddenly, the candles blew out. The basement was plunged into darkness, an oppressive chill sweeping through the room. Katie's scream pierced the silence, jolting us into action. We fumbled in the dark, trying to find a light, but the room seemed to have swallowed all sense of direction. When the lights finally flickered back on, the room's corners seemed darker, filled with unseen eyes watching our every move. Jim tried to laugh it off, but it came out hollow, his usual swagger diminished. None of us noticed when the planchette began to move again, neither smooth nor jerky, but with a purpose that made my stomach churn. Leaning in, I read the new message aloud. GONO. Katie bolted upright, her tear-streaked face reflecting terror. "We need to stop this, now." But Jim, driven by some mix of guilt and curiosity, was undeterred. It's just a game, he insisted, though his trembling hands suggested otherwise. We can't just leave it like this. Then end it, Laura snapped, her voice strained. Say goodbye. Reluctantly, Jim nodded, guiding our hands to the planchette one last time. As it slid to goodbye, the candle flame swayed violently before extinguishing. The sense of relief was fleeting, as the room's lingering chill warned us that we had awakened something that wouldn't be put to rest so easily. We sat in silence for a moment, each of us grappling with the unspoken fear that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The days following that unsettled night were heavy with unspoken dread. Each of us returned to our routines, but the normalcy felt forced. The laughter we used to share felt hollow. Conversations were punctuated with awkward silences, and an ever-present fear lingered just beneath the surface. Katie was the first to openly voice her discomfort. She confided in us that she heard whispers in her room at night, whispers that eerily resembled her grandmother's voice. Laura suggested it might be residual fear, but deep down, we all knew something was terribly wrong. It wasn't long before the occurrences escalated. One evening, Jim called us over to his house, his voice trembling with a panic that we'd never heard before. We found him in his living room, pale and sweating, staring at the Ouija board which he'd tossed into a corner. Around it, items from his grandmother's antique collection were scattered, positioned around the board in a circle. They were objects Jim had sold, but somehow they had returned. "What's going on?" Laura asked, her voice barely masking her fear. Jim shook his head, eyes wide with terror. "I swear, I didn't bring these back, they just appeared." Katie let out a strangled sob. "It's her, Lucy. She's angry because you broke your promise." Suddenly, a picture frame flew off the wall, shattering against the floor. The lights flickered, and a cold wind swirled through the room. We were left in darkness, surrounded by a palpable malevolence. The whispers returned, this time merging into a cacophony of indistinct voices. Laura suggested we consult someone knowledgeable about these occurrences. Her grandmother's stories about protecting against spirits with cleansing rituals came flooding back to her. Desperate for relief, we followed her guidance. We gathered sage, candles, and salt, preparing for a cleansing ritual in Jim's living room. With the items arranged, Laura recited an incantation she remembered from her grandmother. As she spoke, the air seemed to thicken, the oppressive presence dimming momentarily. But as we placed the last bit of salt, the Ouija board's planchette moved on its own, violently spelling out Leave. Panicking, Jim screamed, "Enough! I'm sorry, Grandma! I'll make it right, I swear!" But his sincerity was met with silence, the room's coldness persisting, a chilling reminder of Lucy's unwillingness to forgive. Over the next few days, our lives were plagued by relentless terror. Katie shut herself in, refusing to leave her room as the whispers grew louder. Laura, driven by a desperate need for understanding, buried herself in ancient texts and forbidden knowledge, trying to make sense of the chaos we had invited into our lives. She barely slept, her once vibrant eyes now tired and haunted. As for me, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Every creak in my house, every shadow moving in the corner of my eye, felt like a reminder of that night. I relocated to another city, thinking distance could free me from the torment. But the whispers followed, softer but ever present, lurking in the darkness of each night. I would wake up drenched in sweat, Lucy's voice echoing in my ears, her anger a constant reminder of a broken promise. It became clear that our attempts to escape were futile. The spirit we had summoned was bound to us, feeding off our fear and guilt. One night, the whispers crescendoed into an unbearable pitch. Objects flew off the shelves, and my vision blurred with a cold sweat. Amidst the chaos, one distinct phrase emerged from the cacophony, "Help me." Collapsing to my knees, I whispered a desperate plea, "What do you want from us?" A chilling silence followed before the planchette, which I had kept hidden away, began to move on its own again, tracing out one heart-stopping message, FINJIM. Jim. I hadn't heard from him in days. His disappearance had left a void, an unspoken fear that he was lost forever. But if the spirit wanted us to find him, it meant Jim was somewhere out there, experiencing his own torment. Unwilling to let another friend become a casualty, I reached out to Laura and Katie. Laura, despite her exhaustion, agreed to help, driven by a guilt that mirrored my own. Katie, though terrified, acknowledged that facing our fear was the only way to end our nightmare. We regrouped in the town's library, combing through everything we could find on spirits, Ouija boards, and unfinished business. The librarian raised an eyebrow at our requests, but offered no comments. Each page turned, each whispered discussion, brought us closer to an understanding of the ritual that could possibly free us from Lucy's vengeful grip. Little did we realize that confronting her would demand more than mere knowledge. It would require a confrontation with the very darkness we had unleashed. The journey to free ourselves from Lucy's grip led us back to the place where it all started, Jim's house. We found the front door ajar, a cold draft emanating from within. Stepping inside, the oppressive silence was almost tangible. "Jim," I called out, my voice echoing eerily through the empty halls. There was no answer, only the unsettling feeling of being watched. We made our way to the basement, the epicenter of our nightmare. The flickering lights cast long, distorted shadows, creating an unsettling atmosphere. Katie clung to her grandmother's necklace, her knuckles white with fear. Laura carried a bag filled with items for ritual protection: sage, salt, candles, and a handwritten spell. Jim was there, sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by the relics from his grandmother's collection and the Ouija board. His eyes were wide and vacant, his body motionless as if he were in a trance. "Jim!" I shouted, rushing to his side. His skin was cold, his breathing shallow, and he seemed unresponsive to our presence. "We need to start the ritual," Laura urged, the urgency in her voice barely concealing her fear. "It's the only way to break the connection." We quickly but carefully arranged the items around Jim, forming a protective circle. Laura began her incantation, her voice steady and strong despite the palpable tension. As she spoke, the air seemed to thicken, and the room grew colder still. The candles flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The planchette moved of its own accord, spelling out threatening messages we tried to ignore. "HELPME," it wrote, a command that tugged at our hearts, but we focused on Laura's words, hoping they would be enough to banish the spirit. As the incantation reached its climax, Jim's body convulsed violently. A guttural scream escaped his lips, echoing through the basement and filling us with a primal fear. The candles extinguished all at once, plunging us into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of our ragged breaths in the void. Then, slowly, a dim light began to emanate from within the protective circle. Jim's eyes fluttered open, clarity replacing the vacant look that had haunted them. "Chris?" he croaked, his voice hoarse and weak. "What's happening?" Before I could answer, another presence made itself known. The temperature dropped impossibly lower, and a figure began to materialize within the shadows, a spectral form unmistakably Lucy. Her face twisted in anger and sorrow, her eyes locked onto Jim. "You broke your promise," she hissed, the words dripping with malice. Jim struggled to his feet, facing the apparition. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I was desperate. Please forgive me." Lucy's form wavered, her expression shifting from anger to a profound sadness. "You must make it right," she said, her voice softer now. "You must honor my memory." Jim nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will, I promise." With those words, Lucy's figure faded, the oppressive air lifting slightly. The planchette moved one last time, spelling out GOODBYE. Exhausted but relieved, we watched as the candles relit themselves, their warm glow restoring some semblance of normalcy to the room. The darkness that had loomed so heavily seemed to dissipate, leaving behind a solemn quiet. Jim slumped back to the floor, drained but alive. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry for dragging you into this." Katie knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "We're your friends, Jim. We'll face anything together." Laura, though exhausted, managed a weak smile. "Let's not make a habit of messing with the supernatural, okay?" We all laughed, the sound a welcome relief from the tension that had gripped us for so long. Gathering our things, we left the basement, the air feeling lighter and the shadows less menacing. Outside, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the town in a hopeful glow. Despite the relief, the events of those nights had forever changed us. The whispers had ceased, but the memory of Lucy's voice and the darkness we had encountered would linger in our minds. We had learned a harsh lesson about the dangers of meddling with forces beyond our understanding. As I moved to a new city, far from the place where our nightmare began, I thought I had left it all behind. But late at night, when the world was quiet, I occasionally heard faint whispers, a chilling reminder of the darkness that still lingered in the crevices of my mind. Our lives gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, yet the bond we shared was forever altered by the ordeal we had survived. We had faced the darkness together and emerged stronger, if a bit more wary of the unseen forces lurking just beyond the veil of reality. The night had started innocently enough. It was a typical Friday evening, the kind where friends gather to unwind from the week's stresses. For us, Nathan, Sarah, Mark, and Jake, it meant a few drinks, some good music, and a chance to catch up. My house, with its old-world charm and creaky wooden floors, had been the designated hangout spot for years. We knew its quirks and creaks well, or so we thought. The attic was off limits, not out of any particular concern, but simply because it held years' worth of clutter and forgotten items. But when Mark suggested we dig around for something interesting, curiosity got the better of us. Armed with flashlights and fueled by a few beers, we trudged up the narrow staircase, each step groaning under our weight. The attic was a forgotten realm of dust and shadows, filled with discarded relics of the past. We sifted through old photo albums, faded letters, and broken furniture, laughing at the absurdity of some forgotten fashion choices and marveling at the history trapped in this confined space. It was Sarah who found it, tucked beneath a pile of old books and moth-eaten blankets. She pulled out the Ouija board with a triumphant grin, her eyes sparkling with mischief. The board itself was old, its once vibrant colors faded to a dull sepia. The planchette, a small heart-shaped piece of wood with a glass window, seemed eerily pristine by comparison. "Guys, check this out," she called, brushing off the dust. Mark's eyes lit up. "Oh, this is going to be fun. Let's see if we can summon a ghost or something." I chuckled, shaking my head. "You guys seriously believe in this stuff? It's just a game." Jake shrugged. "Why not? It might be fun to scare ourselves a little." Reluctantly, I agreed. We descended the stairs, a sense of anticipation building among us that I couldn't quite shake off. The living room lights were dimmed, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. We sat around the coffee table, the Ouija board resting ominously in the center. "All right, everyone put your fingers on the planchette," Sarah instructed. There was a nervous energy in her voice, excitement mingling with apprehension. We complied, placing our trembling fingers on the small piece of wood. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint ticking of an old wall clock. "Is anyone there?" Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. For a long moment, nothing happened. I rolled my eyes, about to pull back and make a joke when I felt it, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. The planchette began to glide across the board, stopping at "yes." A collective gasp echoed around the room. My skepticism wavered. "Who are you?" Mark asked, leaning in closer. The planchette moved again, this time more confidently. "Thomas," it spelled out. "Thomas? How old are you?" Jake asked. "8," the board responded. I glanced at my friends, their faces lit by the dim light, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. My heart pounded. The planchette's movements were too synchronized, too deliberate. I tried to rationalize it, to chalk it up to collective subconscious movements, but the chill in the room was undeniable. "What happened to you, Thomas?" Sarah's voice trembled slightly. There was a pause, a moment of stillness that felt like the calm before a storm. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move again, spelling out LOST. A shiver ran down my spine. The playfulness of our gathering had evaporated, replaced by a palpable sense of unease. This was no longer about fun. It felt sinister, wrong. "Let's stop," I said, pulling my hand away. But the planchette moved with renewed vigor, spelling out a chilling message before any of us could react. STAY. The room grew colder. Shadows seemed to creep closer, and the whispers began. Faint at first, like distant voices carried on the wind, they grew louder, more insistent. My heart raced, the logical part of my mind battling the undeniable terror gripping my chest. Who else is here?" Jake stammered. The planchette didn't move. It was in that moment of silence that I realized we had crossed a line. What began as a silly game had turned into something far more dangerous. And as the whispers grew louder, more coherent, I couldn't help but feel that we had invited something into our lives that we couldn't control. DEATH. A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled my hand away. "This is insane. We need to stop," I insisted, my voice shaking. But the planchette moved violently on its own, darting across the board with a speed that defied logic, spelling out a desperate message, STAY. The lights flickered, and shadows seemed to twist in ways they shouldn't. Sarah started to cry softly, her hands trembling. Mark clenched his jaw, defiance flickering in his eyes, while Jake looked near breaking. "I can't do this anymore," Sarah whispered, standing up abruptly. "I'm done." But as she stepped back, the whispers started, faint at first like rustling leaves, but growing louder and more frantic. They seemed to come from every corner of the room, enveloping us in a cacophony of ghostly voices. "Who are you?" I shouted into the cacophony, desperate for answers. The planchette moved once more, spelling out a horrifying truth, DEMON. The room erupted in chaos. The air grew frigid, our breath visible in the dim light. The whispers escalated into screams, and shadows churned around us. A sharp, cold wind seemed to cut through the room, despite the closed windows. "We need to end this now!" Mark shouted, reaching for the board to throw it away. But before he could touch it, the planchette flew across the room, shattering the lamp in the corner. Darkness enveloped us, the only light now the moon filtering weakly through the curtains. "We're trapped," Jake said, his voice a mixture of panic and resignation. "What do we do?" Sarah's eyes were wide with terror, but she nodded in agreement. "Nathan, we have to say goodbye. It's the only way to end this." Gathering my courage, I reached out, my fingers trembling as they touched the planchette. Sarah, Mark, and Jake followed suit, their hands cold as ice. "Goodbye," I said firmly, willing the nightmare to end. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers ceased, the shadows seemed to retreat, and the room felt calm. We exhaled collectively, hoping it was over. But just as we started to relax, the planchette moved once more, slowly, deliberately, spelling out one final word, NEVER. The room plunged into chaos again. The temperature dropped sharply, causing our breaths to mist in the air. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling the room with incomprehensible, maddening voices. Shadows danced along the walls, taking on horrifying, grotesque shapes. The lights flickered violently, casting eerie patterns across our terrified faces. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, but when I turned, no one was there. We tried to retreat, to scramble away from the board, but it seemed to have a magnetic pull, keeping us rooted in place. The once familiar living room now felt alien, oppressive. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the growing sense of dread. Sarah's sobs cut through the cacophony, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. Her fingers clutched at her sides, the force of her trembling visible even in the dim light. Mark, usually so self-assured, was rendered speechless. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a rational explanation that didn't exist. Jake's earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced with a look of sheer helplessness. "We need to leave now," I shouted over the din, my voice barely audible. We stumbled towards the door, but the room seemed to stretch, each step feeling like wading through thick, invisible molasses. The shadows lunged at us, and several times I felt something brush against my skin, cold and clammy, like the touch of the dead. Reaching the door at last, I turned the knob frantically, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as though something on the other side was holding it closed, trapping us in the suffocating darkness. Panic surged through my veins, and I pounded on the door, desperate for an escape. The whispers reached a fever pitch, escalating into agonizing screams. My ears rang, and every nerve in my body screamed to flee, to get away from this malevolent force that was now all too real. And then, with a suddenness that was as shocking as the chaos itself, everything stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence, the temperature slowly rising back to normal. The lights flickered back to a steady glow, and the shadows retreated to their corners. We stood there in stunned silence, hearts racing, the echoes of the screams still ringing in our ears. The Ouija board lay on the table, the planchette resting in the center, as if waiting for its next command. I wanted to destroy it, to rid ourselves of the cursed object, but something in the back of my mind whispered a warning. This wasn't over. I knew, deep down, that as long as the board existed, so did the malevolent spirit tied to it. My friends looked at me, their eyes pleading for a solution, but I had none. We had unleashed something far beyond our understanding, and now we had to find a way to survive it. "We need to figure out how to end this," I said, my voice hoarse. "For good." Their nods of agreement were hesitant but resolute, and as we stepped away from the center of the room, the feeling of dread lingering like an unwelcome guest, I knew that our battle with the unknown had only just begun. Part 3. The days turned into a hazy blur of fear and sleepless nights. The Ouija board had taken a central position in my life, a cursed relic I couldn't seem to get rid of. Sarah, Mark, and Jake grew more distant, our once unshakable bond frayed by the malevolent force we'd unleashed. Desperation led us to research ways to banish the spirit. Sarah, with her spiritual background, suggested a cleansing ritual, a last-ditch effort to rid ourselves of Thomas once and for all. We gathered the necessary items: candles, sage, salt, and holy water. Each of us clung to the faint hope that this ritual could reclaim our lives from the darkness that had consumed them. The night we chose for the ritual was eerily calm. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of our breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. We cleared a space in the living room, placing the Ouija board in the center of a circle of salt. Candles flickered around the perimeter, casting a dim, wavering light. "Let's do this," Sarah said, trying to muster confidence. She held the sage, lighting it and letting the smoke curl around the room. "Spirits of this house, we ask you to leave this place. You are not welcome here." We repeated her words, our voices unsure but growing stronger with each repetition. Mark sprinkled holy water over the board, and Jake added his voice to the incantation, his eyes darting nervously around the room. For a moment, it seemed to work. The air felt lighter, and the shadows receded. But then, a cold gust extinguished the candles, plunging us into darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever before, and the salt circle was disrupted as an unseen force blew it apart. "No!" Sarah shouted, gripping the sage tightly. "You need to leave, now." But the atmosphere grew oppressive. The temperature plummeted, and a piercing cold seemed to seep into our bones. The shadows coalesced, forming grotesque shapes that writhed and undulated around us. The candles flickered back to life briefly, revealing ghastly apparitions that sent shivers down our spines. The Ouija board's planchette began to move on its own, spelling out words that chilled us to the core. Heisthere. The whispers crescendoed into a cacophony, and a powerful gust knocked us to the floor. "I can't take it anymore," Mark shouted, grabbing the board and throwing it across the room. It crashed into the wall but remained unscathed. Defeated, he sank to his knees, hands covering his face. Despair washed over us. We had tried everything we could think of, but nothing seemed to break the hold the spirit had over us. It felt like an oppressive weight, growing heavier with each passing moment. Suddenly, the planchette moved once more, this time spelling a message that sent a new wave of terror through us. "Youcantescape." Jake stumbled back, eyes wide. "We're trapped," he said, voice trembling. "No matter what we do, it won't leave us alone." I felt a surge of anger and defiance. There had to be a way out. We couldn't live like this, forever tormented by a spirit we accidentally summoned. "No, we can't give up," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "We need to find another way." But Sarah, eyes filled with tears, shook her head. "Nathan, we've done everything. I'm scared. I just want it to be over." Exhaustion hit us, our collective hope dwindling with every passing minute. We agreed to part ways for the night, seeking solace in our own homes, hoping to find some semblance of peace. But peace was a distant memory. Shadows haunted every corner of my vision, and the whispers grew louder, more incessant. It felt as though Thomas was mocking me, reveling in my fear. My home, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. Late that night, as I sat in the dim light of my living room, the Ouija board reappeared on the table, untouched. The planchette was already moving when I approached, spelling out a final, horrifying revelation. WEAREON. In that moment, I understood the truth. The spirit had bound itself to me, feeding on my fear and despair. There was no escape. I had become its vessel, its prisoner. The realization shattered what little strength I had left. I collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down my face. My friends had gone, driven away by the darkness that now consumed my life. The Ouija board lay in front of me, a constant, malevolent reminder of the night we had opened a door that could never be closed. And as the whispers grew louder, filling the room with their haunting chorus, I knew that my battle against the unknown was over. The spirit had won, and I was eternally trapped, living in a waking nightmare from which there was no escape.
A Forgotten Pact, Part 1. Sometimes I wish that night had never happened, that we had never sneaked into the attic and found that dusty old Ouija board. We were young, reckless, and bored, craving a thrill, but the thrill we found would haunt me for the rest of my days. I returned to Silver Falls reluctantly, drawn back by the tranquil silence of a small town and the memories buried deep within. After a bad breakup and the chaos of city life, I needed tranquility and familiarity. When I stepped into my childhood home, it felt like stepping into a time capsule. Dust motes floated in the sunlight, streaming through the windows, and I could almost hear the echoes of laughter and whispered secrets from years past. The attic was my first stop. I'd always loved rummaging through old boxes up there, unearthing snippets of forgotten family history. This time, I found something unexpected. A photo from 8 years ago. The sight of our young, smiling faces sent a shiver down my spine. There we were, Mark, Samantha, James, Eliza, Rachel, and me. The night we played the Ouija game was stamped across the bottom in shaky handwriting. As I set the photo aside, something caught my eye in the corner of the attic. It was the old Ouija board, still in its tattered box. My heart raced as memories flooded back. Did all our nightmares begin here? 8 years earlier, it seemed like a fun idea. We gathered around the board in my dimly lit room, candles casting a warm glow. The air was thick with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "Is anyone there?" I had asked, trying to contain my nervous giggles. We waited, breathless. The planchette moved slowly, deliberately spelling out YES. Our laughter faded, replaced with uneasy glances. Over time, we learned the spirit's name, Ethan. At first, his answers were vague, but then he started revealing things only we could know. Secrets of our hearts, fears, and even mundane details from our private lives. The room grew colder, shadows lengthening unnaturally. Samantha, relentless and bold, had pushed us further. "If you're really there, prove it. Show us a sign." In response, the hall mirror shattered. Our screams echoed as shards of glass scattered across the floor. In the present, the silence of the attic felt stifling. I wiped off the dust from the board, each breath echoing loudly in my ears. It was then that I remembered the pack of friends who had vowed to stay connected forever. But forever is a long time, especially when death begins claiming your friends one by one. First, it was James, his life cut short by a mysterious car crash. Then Eliza, a bright soul found lifeless in her apartment. Mark's descent into madness followed, his words fragmented and haunted. Fingers trembling, I traced the letters on the board, and memories blurred with the present. I had to know if there was a connection, or if my mind was conjuring horrors from grief. I reached out to the only person left who might understand my fear, Rachel. We hadn't spoken in years, but her voice over the phone was a familiar comfort, albeit tinged with the same unease that constricted my chest. "Jenny, it can't be real," she insisted, but her words lacked conviction. "Meet me at my place tonight. We need to figure this out." The reunion was bittersweet. Rachel's eyes, once full of mischief, now mirrored my own dread. Her tiny apartment was cluttered with paintings, a testament to her artistic spirit, but the usual warmth was missing. Shadows seemed to lurk in every corner, and the air was cold despite the heater's steady hum. We sat on the floor, the Ouija board between us like some malignant relic. I recounted the deaths, the fear lacing my voice. Rachel was silent, staring at the board with wide eyes. "We need to end this," she whispered. The room darkened as we dimmed the lights, and with trembling hands we began. "Is anyone there?" My voice was barely more than a whisper. The planchette moved almost immediately, like it had been waiting. The answers were immediate, cutting through our disbelief. Ethan was still there, and he was not pleased. His words spelled out our doom, a promise from years ago we had forgotten, but he had not. Suddenly, the room's temperature dropped, and a sense of dread enveloped us. The shadows in Rachel's apartment seemed to grow, and a whispering echo filled the air. "Jenny, stop," Rachel begged, but it was too late. We had opened a door that was never meant to be opened. The silence that followed was deafening, and I locked eyes with Rachel, understanding that our lives were no longer our own. The chilling realization that the pact we made that night was now our curse, a debt that Ethan had come to collect. The Forgotten Pact, Part 2. The days following our encounter with Ethan were filled with an oppressive sense of inevitability. I could barely sleep, haunted by nightmares of twisted shadows and whispering voices. Rachel and I spoke often, our conversations tinged with an undercurrent of terror. One rainy morning, I received a call that froze my blood. Rachel's voice, trembling, broke through the static. "Jenny, James is dead." Time seemed to stand still as I grasped at the edge of the kitchen counter, the phone slipping from my fingers. Images of James flashed in my mind, the goofy grin that always put us at ease during our late-night conversations. And now, he was gone. The funeral was a somber affair held under a relentless downpour. The sight of his parents' grief-stricken faces was almost too much to bear. I stood beside Rachel, her hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. We didn't speak. There were no words for the hollow emptiness that James's death left behind. As the casket was lowered into the ground, I glanced around at the mourners. Everyone looked devastated, but there was an undeniable tension in the air, a shared understanding that this wasn't a simple tragedy. I caught Rachel's eye, and we both understood. We had to act before it was too late. A few nights later, Rachel and I made the grim decision to visit Mark. No one had seen him in weeks, and reports from the institution were disturbing, to say the least. We were led through cold, sterile hallways, the fluorescent lights flickering ominously. Mark was barely recognizable. His once athletic frame had wasted away, and his eyes, once filled with life, were now vacant and haunted. He sat huddled in a corner, muttering to himself. When he saw us, there was a flicker of recognition, followed by a look of abject terror. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "The shadows, they whisper, they watch." I squeezed Rachel's hand, trying to suppress my own fear. "Mark, we need your help. We need to end this." His eyes darted around the room, as if seeing things we couldn't. "It's too late. We made the pact. We didn't understand, but Ethan did." As we left the institution, the weight of Mark's words settled heavily on us. The sense of dread only grew stronger. The shadows seemed to stretch and follow us like elongated ghouls. Back at Rachel's apartment, everything felt amplified. The paintings seemed darker, the air even chillier. We knew we couldn't wait any longer. Desperation fueled our resolve, driving us to search for a way out. We pored over old texts, websites devoted to occult lore, and any scraps of information that might hold a solution. Our research led us to a ritual, supposedly capable of severing ties with malevolent spirits. The directions were archaic, the Latin phrases challenging to decipher, but we believed it was our best chance. We gathered the necessary items: salt, candles, a dagger, and a bowl for blood, a required sacrifice. The night we attempted the ritual was one I will never forget. Rachel's apartment was dark, save for the candlelight casting a faint, flickering glow. The atmosphere was thick with tension and fear. We followed the instructions to the letter, invoking the spirits and calling upon ancient protections. As I made the initial cut on my palm, letting the blood drip into the bowl, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The room seemed to constrict around us, shadows pressing in. "Rachel, are you ready?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. She nodded, but before we could proceed, the temperature plummeted and the shadows began to writhe and pulse. A low, guttural whisper filled the room, growing louder, more aggressive. "No," Rachel gasped, eyes widening with terror. The candles flickered violently before going out completely, plunging us into darkness. In that pitch blackness, I felt a cold hand grip my arm tightly. I heard Rachel scream, but before I could react, the darkness swallowed us both. When the lights flickered back on, Rachel lay motionless on the floor, her eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. The ritual had failed, and Ethan had claimed another life. The Forgotten Pact, Part 3. Rachel's lifeless eyes haunted me as I stumbled out of the apartment, my mind reeling. How had everything gone so wrong? I felt Ethan's presence closing in, the air growing colder, the shadows darker with every step I took. Left alone, I knew I had no choice but to face Ethan directly. I returned to my childhood home, each room filled with memories now tainted by fear. I gathered whatever strength I had left and set up the Ouija board in the living room, lighting candles around it in a circle. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the walls, creating an eerie dance of light and darkness. I sat down, my fingers trembling as they rested on the planchette. "Ethan," I called out, my voice firm despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "What do you want from me?" The planchette moved swiftly, almost eagerly. DEATH. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "If I give you my life, will you let the others rest in peace?" Silence stretched before the planchette began to move again. CYCLE. The word sent a chill down my spine. The realization hit me. Ethan wasn't just after us. We were pawns in a perpetual cycle of horror. "Stop this," I demanded, my voice breaking. "Why are you doing this?" The planchette stilled, then began to spell out a single horrifying word. BIND. My heart sank as I understood. Ethan wasn't just any spirit. He thrived on the fear and lives of those who dared to summon him. The cycle began and ended with him, and there was no true escape. Desperate and determined, I decided to perform the ritual again, hoping that my self-sacrifice would at least contain Ethan and end his cycle here. I made the same preparations, but this time I cut deeper, the pain a sharp reminder of my mortality. Blood dripped onto the board, and I began the incantation, my voice shaking but resolute. "Ethan, by this blood I bind you. I offer my life in place of this curse." The room grew icy, the candles flickering wildly. Shadows around me convulsed, and the air filled with angry whispers. Pain surged through me, but I kept going, repeating the phrases, urging Ethan to take me and end this torment. The room darkened further, and I felt a coldness wrap around my body, squeezing the air from my lungs. My vision blurred, and I knew my time was short. As I chanted the final words, I saw a light flicker in the corner of my eye. For a moment, the shadows seemed to recede, and I felt a strange sense of peace. I knew then that I was not alone. The spirits of my friends surrounded me, their presence lending me strength. With my last breath, I finished the incantation, the world around me fading into darkness. I expected oblivion, but what awaited me was far worse. When I awoke, it was no longer my home. I found myself in a dark, featureless space, cold and silent. Ethan stood before me, his eyes gleaming with what could only be described as satisfaction. "Welcome," he whispered. "Your debt is paid, but the cycle continues." Despair washed over me as I realized my sacrifice had not ended Ethan's reign of terror. I was trapped, another soul in his collection. I could only watch as he stepped towards the void, ready to claim his next victim. Years or moments later, I couldn't tell. I watched through shadowed corners as a new group of teenagers, oblivious to the dark history of this place, discovered the old Ouija board in the attic of my childhood home. They giggled and whispered just as we had, unaware of the horrors they were about to unleash. Ethan's cycle began anew, with me now powerless and bound within it, a silent witness to the darkness that would claim them one by one.